I can see the mist rising from the rails this evening, the kind of pale fog that gathers low to the ground when iron has cooled after a long day, and somewhere in that mist there is the faint echo of something that changed the world, not all at once, but gradually, persistently, the way water wears stone into new shapes. There was a time when distance was measured differently, when a journey from one town to another might take days on horseback, weeks by carriage, and the thought of moving heavy goods across a vast landscape seemed almost beyond imagining. Coal sat deep in mines, or rested in the earth, and the energy required to move these things, well, it moved at the pace of horses, of human muscle, of wind-filling sails on canals. But there were people who dreamed in different rhythms, who watched steam rise from kettles and saw not just vapor, but possibility, potential, power waiting to be harnessed, and in workshops scattered across England in the late 1700s and early 1800s, a quiet revolution was taking shape. One that would not announce itself with proclamations or manifestos, but with the hiss of steam, the turn of wheels, the gradual acceleration of progress itself. The night feels particularly still when I think about those early years, when the idea of a self-moving engine seemed almost magical, almost impossible. Inventors and engineers working by candlelight, sketching designs, calculating pressures, imagining what might happen if steam, that invisible force, could be contained, directed, transformed into motion. Picture the English countryside in those days, green hills rolling toward horizons, stone walls dividing fields, and cutting through this landscape. Narrow tracks of iron rails, originally laid for horse-drawn wagons carrying coal from mines to rivers. Simple things, these early railways, just wooden rails sometimes topped with iron plates, and horses pulling loads that would have been impossible to move otherwise. One horse could pull on rails what might take 10 horses to drag over rough roads, and yet, even in this simple system, there was a recognition, a dawning awareness that if somehow, some way, the horse could be replaced with something more powerful, something tireless, something that burned coal to create its own strength, then distance itself might collapse, might become something different, something smaller. I find myself imagining the sounds of those transitional years, the clip of hooves on hard ground, the creak of wooden wheels on iron rails, the voices of men calling out as loads were secured, and beneath it all, in workshops and engine houses, the newer sounds beginning to emerge, the clank of metal being shaped, the roar of fire in experimental boilers, the cautious, careful, almost tentative hiss of steam being released under controlled pressure. Because steam itself was not new, humans had observed its power for centuries, had seen it lift kettle lids, had wondered at its force, but to capture it, to build a vessel strong enough to contain its pressure without exploding, to channel that pressure into rotary motion, into the turning of wheels. This required a particular kind of thinking, a blend of theoretical understanding and practical craft, of mathematical precision and intuitive feel for materials and forces. The stars are visible tonight, scattered across a clear winter sky. And I wonder if those early engineers looked up at the same constellations, pondering the problems they faced, the challenge of creating something that had never quite existed before. Not just an improvement on existing technology, but a fundamental reimagining of how power could be generated, controlled, and applied to the movement of heavy loads across landscape. There were failures. Of course there were failures. Boilers that couldn't maintain pressure, cylinders that wore down too quickly, designs that looked elegant on paper but proved impractical in iron and steam. And yet each failure taught something, revealed some principle, some relationship between heat and pressure, between the diameter of a cylinder and the force it could generate, between the weight of an engine and the adhesion of iron wheels on iron rails. And in this slow accumulation of knowledge, this patient building of understanding through trial and observation and modification, something was emerging, something that would eventually carry goods and people across continents, that would shrink the perceived size of nations, that would make the remote accessible, the distant near, that would create new patterns of commerce and migration, new ways of thinking about time and space and possibility. But tonight, in this quiet moment, I'm interested in the beginning, in those uncertain years when the locomotive was more dream than reality, more ambition than achievement, when a handful of engineers believed, truly believed, that they could build a machine that would move itself, that would breathe fire and exhale steam and roll forward on rails with a power derived not from muscle, but from the transformation of heat into motion, from the ancient energy stored in coal, released suddenly, dramatically, into the present moment. The air feels cool, gentle, and in my mind I can almost see the glow of forge fires in those early workshops, can almost hear the sound of hammers shaping metal, can almost sense the mixture of excitement and uncertainty, the knowledge that something significant was being born, even if its full implications couldn't yet be understood. The story begins, as so many stories of transformation do, with someone noticing what others had overlooked, with the recognition that a tool designed for one purpose might be adapted, reimagined, transformed into something far more significant. In the coal mines of England, particularly in the north, there had long been a problem, a challenge that grew more pressing as mines dug deeper into the earth. Water seeped into these underground chambers, pooled in the lowest shafts, and without some means of removing it, the mines would flood, rendering the coal inaccessible, the workers unable to descend, the entire enterprise threatened by the simple, persistent, patient accumulation of groundwater. And so engines were developed, stationary engines that used steam pressure to drive pumps, great beams that rocked back and forth, drawing water up from the depths. These were the atmospheric engines, improved over decades, refined by engineers like Thomas Newcomen in the early 1700s. Massive structures of beam and cylinder, of valves and condensers that stood beside mine shafts and labored day and night, breathing steam, exhausting vapor, keeping the water at bay. But these engines were fixed in place, anchored to the ground, built into permanent structures. They could pump, but they could not move, and therein lay both their utility and their limitation. It was a Cornish engineer named Richard Trevithick who began to see things differently, who looked at these stationary engines and wondered, what if the engine itself could move? What if instead of being a building, it could be a vehicle? What if steam pressure, properly harnessed, could propel not just a pump rod, but an entire machine along a track? Trevithick was working in the late 1700s in a landscape dominated by tin and copper mines, where steam engines pumped water and hauled ore, and he possessed that particular combination of theoretical knowledge and hands-on experience, the ability to understand pressure and temperature, to calculate forces and design mechanisms, but also to work with metal, to see how components might fit together, to imagine solutions that existed nowhere except in his own mind. The key insight, the crucial development that made everything else possible, was the high-pressure steam engine. Earlier engines had operated at pressures barely above atmospheric, using the vacuum created by condensing steam to generate force. But Trevithick realized that if he could build a boiler strong enough to contain steam at much higher pressures, and if he could design cylinders and pistons to harness that pressure directly, he could create an engine far more powerful relative to its size, compact enough, light enough to mount on wheels. This was not without risk. High-pressure steam meant high-pressure danger. Boilers could explode. Had exploded, sending metal shards and scalding vapor through workshops, killing operators, destroying buildings. The fear of such catastrophes was real, well-founded, and yet Trevithick believed the benefits outweighed the dangers, believed that with proper design, proper materials, proper understanding of the forces involved, a high-pressure engine could be made safely, reliably, on Christmas Eve in 1801 in the town of Camborne in Cornwall. Trevithick demonstrated something the world had never quite seen before: a steam-powered road carriage, a machine that carried passengers up a hill called Beacon Hill, moving under its own power, breathing steam and smoke, a mechanical thing that moved like a living creature, though built of iron and fire. The demonstration was brief. The machine suffered a mechanical failure days later and was damaged in a fire, but the principle had been proven. Steam could propel. Engines could move themselves. The age of the horse, while far from over, had encountered its eventual successor. But roads were rough, uneven, and the weight of a steam engine, even a compact high-pressure design, was substantial. Wheels sank into mud, got caught on stones. The efficiency was poor, the practical applications limited, and so attention turned to those iron rails, those smooth parallel tracks, already being used in mines and quarries, where a horse could pull remarkable loads because the friction was so much less than on ordinary roads. What if, Trevithick wondered, what if a steam engine ran on rails instead of roads? What if those smooth iron surfaces that made horse-drawn wagons so efficient could also benefit a mechanical engine, allowing it to pull even heavier loads, to move with even greater efficiency? In 1804, at the Penydarren Iron Works in Wales, Trevithick built a locomotive, an actual railway locomotive designed to run on existing tramway rails. It was an ungainly thing by later standards, a cylindrical boiler lying horizontal, a single cylinder driving the wheels through gears, a tall chimney rising from one end. The whole apparatus mounted on a wheeled frame. The purpose was simple: to settle a wager. The ironworks owner had bet 500 guineas, a substantial sum, that Trevithick's engine could haul 10 tons of iron along the tramway from Penydarren to Abercynon, a distance of nearly 10 miles. Skeptics abounded. Many believed the smooth iron wheels would simply slip on smooth iron rails, that there wouldn't be enough grip, enough adhesion to pull such a load. But on February 21st, 1804, the locomotive moved, slowly, cautiously, pulling its load of iron, plus 70 men who had climbed aboard to witness this moment. It traveled the full distance, taking just over 4 hours, averaging nearly 5 miles per hour, proving beyond doubt that iron wheels on iron rails could indeed generate sufficient friction, that steam power could be applied to railway transport, that a new era was technically feasible. And yet, and this is the curious thing about innovation, proving something is possible and making it practical are two very different achievements. Trevithick's locomotive was too heavy for the rails it ran on. The cast iron rails broke under its weight. The tramway owners were not pleased. And though the technical success was undeniable, the commercial application remained elusive. Trevithick built other locomotives, demonstrated them in London, created a circular track near Euston Square where the public could pay to ride behind a steam engine, calling the exhibition Catch Me Who Can. But public enthusiasm didn't translate into industrial adoption. The technology was proven, but not yet refined, not yet matched to the right application, the right infrastructure, the right economic conditions. For a time, the locomotive remained a curiosity, a mechanical wonder that existed on the margins of practical transportation. Colliery owners continued to use horses. Canal operators continued to rely on barges. The existing systems worked well enough, and the investment required to build railways specifically designed for steam locomotives, railways with stronger rails, better gradients, purpose-built infrastructure, seemed daunting, uncertain, risky. But in the coal fields of northeastern England, particularly around Newcastle and the surrounding regions, the problem of coal transport was becoming acute. The mines were producing enormous quantities. The demand in London and other cities was growing, and the existing methods, horses on wooden wagonways, boats on rivers and canals, were reaching their limits. Capacity constraints were real. Costs were high, and there was a growing recognition that whoever could solve the transport problem, whoever could move coal more efficiently from mine to market, would gain tremendous advantage. It was in this environment, this landscape of economic pressure and technical possibility, that a new generation of engineers began working with locomotives, not as curiosities, not as demonstrations of principle, but as practical tools, as machines that needed to be reliable, efficient, economically viable. Among these engineers was a man named William Hedley, who in 1813 designed a locomotive called Puffing Billy for the Wylam Colliery. It was a more refined machine than Trevithick's earlier attempts, with better weight distribution, improved mechanical reliability, and it worked, truly worked, hauling coal wagons day after day, proving that a locomotive could be not just a technical success, but an operational asset. And there was Timothy Hackworth, who would later become instrumental in locomotive development, working at the time on stationary engines, but watching, learning, understanding the principles that made steam locomotion possible. But the figure who would come to dominate this era, who would take the scattered innovations and experimental machines and transform them into a coherent, practical, revolutionary system, was a man named George Stephenson, born in 1781 in Wylam, Northumberland, into a world where coal and steam were already reshaping the landscape, where the marriage of the two would soon reshape the world. Stevenson's background was not one of formal education. He couldn't read until he was 18, learned through observation and practice, worked his way up from fireman to engine wright, maintaining and repairing the stationary engines that powered the coal mines. And in this hands-on environment, surrounded by steam and machinery, he developed an intuitive understanding of how these systems worked, what made them efficient or inefficient, reliable or prone to failure. In 1814, the same year Puffing Billy was proving itself at Wylam, Stephenson built his first locomotive, named Blücher after the Prussian general. For the Killingworth colliery where he worked, it wasn't radically different from other locomotives of the period, but it worked reliably, and Stephenson, unlike many inventors before him, didn't just build a machine and move on. He stayed with it, refined it, solved the problems that emerged during actual operation, learned from every failure, incorporated every improvement. Over the next several years, Stephenson built more locomotives, each one incorporating lessons from the previous designs, improving the valve gear, the coupling rods, the arrangement of the wheels, and crucially, he began to think not just about the locomotive itself, but about the entire system, the rails, the gradients, the curves, the infrastructure that would allow locomotives to operate at their full potential. Because a locomotive is only as good as the railway it runs on, and the existing tramways, designed for horse-drawn wagons, with their sharp curves and uneven grades and relatively light rails, were not ideal for steam traction. What was needed, Stephenson increasingly understood, was a purpose-built railway, engineered from the beginning for locomotives, with proper foundations, strong rails, gentle curves and gradients that would allow these machines to move efficiently, economically, transforming the very landscape to accommodate a new form of movement. The opportunity came in 1821 when a group of businessmen and coal owners proposed building a railway, not just another colliery tramway, but an actual public railway, to connect the coal fields around Darlington with the port of Stockton, a distance of about 25 miles, to be called the Stockton and Darlington Railway. The question was, should this railway use horses, as was traditional, or should it use locomotives, as some of the more forward-thinking promoters suggested? And if locomotives, who should design them? Who understood both the machines and the railways well enough to make the entire system work? The answer, increasingly, seemed to be George Stephenson. Stephenson was appointed engineer to the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1821, and with this appointment, the nature of railway building began to change, to evolve from simple tramways into something more ambitious, more carefully engineered, more systematic in its approach to the challenges of moving heavy loads across distance. The work required was immense, surveying the route, determining the optimal path between collieries and coast, calculating gradients that would allow loaded wagons to descend by gravity, while empty wagons could be pulled back up by horses or stationary engines, or increasingly in Stephenson's vision, by locomotives capable of hauling trains in both directions. And so the landscape was measured, marked, transformed. Cuttings were dug through hills, embankments were raised across valleys, and when the river Skern presented an obstacle, Stephenson designed a bridge, not of wood, but of stone, an elegant arched structure that still stands today, a monument to the permanence with which this new infrastructure was being built. Recognition that this was not temporary, not experimental, but the foundation of something enduring. The rails themselves represented a crucial decision. Earlier, tramways had used cast iron, brittle, prone to breaking under heavy loads, but wrought iron was becoming available, stronger, more flexible, better able to withstand the repeated passage of weighted wheels, and Stephenson specified rails of wrought iron, fish-bellied in cross-section, deeper in the middle to provide strength where it was most needed, supported on stone blocks rather than wooden sleepers, every detail considered, every choice made with an eye toward durability and performance. And then there were the locomotives. Stephenson established works at Newcastle, employing skilled craftsmen, building engines to his own designs, and for the Stockton and Darlington, he constructed locomotion number 1, a machine that embodied years of accumulated knowledge. Improvements tested on the colliery railways, refinements that made it more reliable than its predecessors, more powerful, more suited to the work it would be asked to perform. On September 27th, 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened, and locomotion number 1, with Stephenson's brother James at the controls, pulled a train of wagons loaded with coal and flour, plus a passenger coach called Experiment that carried directors and dignitaries along the route from Darlington towards Stockton. Crowds gathered to watch, tens of thousands of people lining the track, witnessing something unprecedented. A machine pulling a train at speeds reaching 15 miles per hour, faster than any horse could maintain with such a load. The opening day was ceremony, spectacle, demonstration. But what mattered more was what came after, the daily operation, the routine hauling of coal from pit to port. And here the railway proved its worth, not in dramatic fashion, but through the steady accumulation of tons moved, costs reduced, efficiency gained. Horses were still used for some services, particularly the passenger coaches that ran on regular schedules, but increasingly, locomotives handled the heavy freight, the coal that was the railway's reason for existence. And yet, even as the Stockton and Darlington demonstrated that railways could work, that they could operate profitably, that steam locomotion was practical for freight, there remained skepticism about passenger service, about whether people would want to ride behind these noisy, smoky, somewhat unpredictable machines, whether the speed would be tolerable, whether the public would embrace this new form of travel. The answer would come with the next great railway project, and it would transform not just transportation, but the entire conception of what railways could be, what they could mean, how they could reshape the geography of commerce and daily life. Liverpool and Manchester, two cities barely 30 miles apart, yet separated by difficult terrain, by the lack of good roads, by a canal monopoly that charged high rates and suffered from frequent delays. Liverpool was a great port, gateway to Atlantic trade, while Manchester was becoming the world's first industrial city, its cotton mills driving the British economy, and the movement of raw cotton from port to mills, of finished goods from mills to port, was a constant bottleneck, a limitation on growth, a problem crying out for solution. Various proposals had been made, canal improvements, new roads, but a group of merchants and industrialists, frustrated by the existing system, began to consider something more radical, a railway, not just for coal like the Stockton and Darlington, but for general freight and passengers, a railway that would compete directly with the canals, that would offer faster, more reliable, more economical service. The challenge was significant. The terrain between Liverpool and Manchester included chat moss, a vast peat bog that many believed impossible to cross with any kind of permanent way. There were hills requiring deep cuttings, valleys requiring high embankments, and there was fierce opposition from canal owners, from turnpike trusts, from landowners who didn't want locomotives crossing their estates, from those who feared the railways or who benefited from the existing transport system. But George Stephenson, appointed chief engineer in 1826, believed it could be done, and he set about proving it, surveying routes, planning the engineering works, and when Parliament held hearings on whether to authorize the railway, Stephenson testified, though his thick Northumbrian accent and lack of formal education made him vulnerable to withering cross-examination by canal company lawyers who sought to paint him as unqualified. The bill was initially rejected, but the railway promoters persisted, hired additional engineers to refine the survey, addressed the concerns raised in Parliament, and in 1826 a new bill passed, authorization was granted, and construction began on what would become the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the world's first intercity passenger railway, the prototype for everything that would follow. The engineering works were extraordinary. At Olive Mount, a cutting was excavated through 2 miles of rock, in some places 60 feet deep, requiring the removal of thousands of tons of stone, all done by hand, by laborers with picks and shovels and wheelbarrows, with occasional help from gunpowder charges that would loosen the rock, the noise, the dust, the sheer physical effort involved, almost beyond modern comprehension. At Sankey Brook, a viaduct was required, 9 arches spanning the valley, 50 feet high, built of brick, some 20 million bricks in total, each one laid by hand, the structure massive, permanent, designed to carry not just the railways of that moment, but the heavier trains and higher speeds that might come in future years. And Chatmoss, the peat bog that skeptics insisted would swallow any railway attempted across it. Stephenson conquered through persistence and ingenuity, floating the railway on a bed of heather and branches, layering material until a stable foundation emerged, draining water, gradually building up the embankment until rails could be laid across ground that had seemed impassable, proving that engineering could overcome nature's obstacles, that careful study and determined effort could solve problems that appeared insoluble. But perhaps the most significant decision, the choice that would define not just this railway but the future of rail transport, concerned motive power. Should the Liverpool and Manchester use stationary engines with cables that would haul trains between fixed points, or should it use locomotives, mobile engines that would travel with the trains they pulled? The debate was real. Stationary engines were proven, reliable. Their power output was predictable, whereas locomotives were still relatively new, somewhat experimental, their long-term reliability uncertain. Many of the railway's directors favored the stationary engine approach, the conservative choice, the safe choice, but Stephenson advocated for locomotives, believing they offered greater flexibility, easier operation, better economics, and to settle the question, to demonstrate what locomotives could achieve. The railway directors organized a competition, the Rainhill Trials, held in October of 1829, where locomotive builders would compete to show whose engine was fastest, most reliable, most economical, capable of meeting the demanding specifications set forth by the railway company. The trials were held on a level stretch of completed track near Rainhill, and they became a public spectacle. Thousands of people gathering to watch these mechanical marvels compete, to see which would prove superior, which would earn the right to power the new railway. Several engines were entered, some serious contenders, others more fanciful. There was cycloped, essentially a horse on a treadmill, quickly disqualified. There was perseverance, damaged in transit and unable to complete the trials. And there were 3 serious competitors: Sans Pareil, built by Timothy Hackworth; Novelty, built by John Braithwaite and John Erickson; and Rocket, built by George Stephenson and his son Robert, who had been studying engineering formally, bringing theoretical knowledge to complement his father's practical experience. Sans Pareil was powerful, traditional in design. Similar to earlier Stephenson locomotives, it performed well initially but suffered mechanical failures. A cracked cylinder that ended its participation. It was capable but not quite reliable enough, not quite refined enough for the demands being placed upon it. Novelty was radical, lightweight, with a vertical boiler and sophisticated mechanical arrangements. It achieved impressive speeds, delighting the crowds, but it too suffered from reliability issues, leaking joints, mechanical problems, the price of innovation sometimes being fragility, complexity that created points of failure. And then there was Rocket, and Rocket was different, not because it introduced any single revolutionary feature, but because it combined several important innovations into a coherent, reliable, effective design. It had a multi-tube boiler with 25 copper tubes running through the water, dramatically increasing the heating surface, allowing more efficient generation of steam. It had a blast pipe, directing exhaust steam up the chimney, creating a draft that drew air through the firebox, intensifying combustion. These features working together, each enhancing the other, creating a machine significantly more powerful and efficient than its predecessors. Over several days, Rocket performed, hauling weighted trains back and forth along the trial section, maintaining required speeds, proving reliable, economical, superior. The Stephensons had not just built a locomotive, they had built the template, the archetype, the fundamental design that would inform locomotive construction for decades to come. Rocket won the trials, earned the prize money of £500, but more importantly, won the argument, proved that locomotives were ready, that they could provide the power, the reliability, the economy that a major railway required. The decision was made. The Liverpool and Manchester would be a locomotive railway, and George Stephenson would build the engines. The railway opened on September 15th, 1830, with grand ceremony, the Duke of Wellington attending, 8 trains carrying dignitaries, crowds lining the route, and tragedy too, for William Huskisson, a member of Parliament, was struck by rocket during the opening ceremonies, becoming the first person killed by a railway locomotive. A sobering reminder that this new technology carried risks as well as benefits, that speed and power demanded respect, caution, new ways of thinking about safety and operation. But despite this tragedy, the railway was an immediate success. Passenger numbers exceeded all projections. Within weeks, the trains were carrying hundreds of people daily between the two cities, traveling in an hour and a half what had previously taken 4 or 5 hours by coach. The fare was affordable, the service regular, and people embraced it, not with fear or reluctance, but with enthusiasm, with excitement at this new experience, this new velocity of life, and the implications rippled outward. Other cities looked at Liverpool and Manchester and saw possibility, saw opportunity. Railway schemes were proposed across Britain. Investors eager to fund construction, engineers eager to build, a railway mania beginning to take hold. The recognition that this technology was not just viable, but transformative, that it would remake the landscape, the economy, the very experience of distance and time. The 1830s saw railway construction accelerate across Britain, lines radiating outward from London, connecting cities that had never known such intimate contact. Birmingham, Bristol, Southampton, each new railway requiring its own Acts of Parliament, its own surveys and negotiations, its own monumental engineering works. And at the center of much of this expansion was George Stephenson and his son Robert, consulting on routes, designing locomotives, establishing the standards that would define railway practice. One of the most significant decisions, one that seems almost mundane yet had profound consequences, was the choice of gauge, the distance between the rails. Early railways had used various gauges, whatever seemed appropriate for local conditions. But as networks began to connect, the need for standardization became apparent. Trains needed to run from one railway onto another, through carriages needed to traverse multiple companies' lines, and inconsistent gauge would make this impossible. Stephenson favored 4 feet 8.5 inches, the gauge he had used on the Stockton and Darlington and Liverpool and Manchester, a measurement derived from the old wagon ways of Northumberland, where wheel spacing had been determined by the width of carts, which in turn may have descended from Roman chariot widths, ancient patterns, perpetuating into the industrial age. And as Stephenson's influence spread, as railways across Britain adopted his gauge, it became the standard, eventually termed standard gauge, the width that most of the world's railways would follow, though not all. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, engineer of this great Western Railway connecting London to Bristol, believed a broader gauge would allow for greater stability, higher speeds, more comfortable travel, and he built his railway to 7 feet and a quarter-inch gauge, creating a magnificent engineering works, the Box Tunnel, nearly 2 miles long through the Cotswold Hills, and locomotives designed specifically for this broader track, achieving speeds and smoothness that Brunel believed vindicated his choice. But the incompatibility created problems. Passengers and freight traveling between standard gauge and broad gauge railways had to change trains. Goods had to be unloaded and reloaded, and as the standard gauge network grew larger, more extensive, the broad gauge became increasingly isolated. Eventually, the Great Western would be forced to convert, to abandon Brunel's vision in favor of compatibility, standardization proving more valuable than theoretical superiority. The locomotives themselves evolved rapidly during these years. Robert Stephenson, taking increasing control of the locomotive works as his father focused on railway surveying and promotion, designed engines that were more sophisticated, more powerful, more refined than Rocket had been, the Planet class, the Patentee class, incorporating improvements in valve gear, in boiler design, in the arrangement of cylinders and wheels, each generation of locomotives learning from the previous, incorporating the lessons of operation, the knowledge gained from thousands of miles of running, and other engineers contributed their innovations. Timothy Hackworth continuing to develop locomotives in the Northeast, experimenting with different cylinder arrangements, different approaches to generating and using steam, and across the Atlantic, in America, engineers adapted British designs to local conditions, to lighter rails and tighter curves, to the vast distances and different economic constraints of a newer, less densely settled land. The 1840s saw railway construction reach a fever pitch, particularly in Britain, where what became known as railway mania gripped investors and promoters alike. Schemes were proposed to connect virtually every town of consequence, some sensible and well-planned, others wildly optimistic or outright fraudulent, and vast sums of money were invested, fortunes made and lost, as the railway network expanded from hundreds of miles to thousands. The social impact was becoming apparent. Farmers could send fresh milk to distant cities, arriving before it spoiled. Fish caught in the morning could be in London by evening. Newspapers printed in the capital could reach provincial towns the same day. Information, goods, people, all flowing faster than ever before. The friction of distance reduced, though never eliminated, the locomotive shrinking Britain, making it more unified, more interconnected, more aware of itself as a single space rather than a collection of isolated localities. And the experience of railway travel itself was becoming normalized, no longer a novelty, but a routine part of life for millions. The railway timetable becoming a fixture of daily planning, the station becoming a new kind of public space, the waiting room, the platform, the booking office, entirely new architectures emerging to serve this new form of movement, great sheds of iron and glass, like St. Pancras and Paddington, cathedrals dedicated not to worship, but to departure and arrival, to the continual flow of humanity through space. The locomotives of mid-century were larger than their predecessors, more powerful, capable of hauling longer trains at higher speeds. Engineers had learned to build bigger boilers, to use steam more efficiently, to design wheel arrangements that distributed weight while providing traction. The classic configuration emerging, with a leading truck of small wheels for guidance, large driving wheels for speed and power, and trailing wheels to support the firebox, each element serving its purpose, the whole machine a study in functional elegance. But even as railways reached their zenith in Britain, becoming the dominant form of land transport, the most visible symbol of industrial progress, they were spreading globally to Europe, where France and Germany and Italy built networks connecting their territories, to India, where British engineers laid tracks across vast distances, serving colonial administration and commerce, to the Americas, where railways would play a crucial role in westward expansion, in the binding together of a continent. In the United States, the railway took on particular significance, a tool of nation building, of manifest destiny. The first transcontinental railway, completed in 1869 when the Union Pacific and Central Pacific met at Promontory Summit in Utah, represented not just an engineering achievement, but a political statement, a declaration that the country stretched from ocean to ocean, that distance could be conquered, that settlement and commerce could follow the rails into the territories that had seemed remote, inaccessible, beyond the practical reach of civilization. The locomotives that hauled trains across America were different from their British cousins, adapted to local conditions, to steeper grades and sharper curves, to lighter rails and rougher roadbeds. American engines featured cow catchers to clear debris from the tracks, large headlamps for night running through unsettled country, and distinctive styling, bright paint and polished brass. Names and numbers proudly displayed, each locomotive an individual, a personality, not just a machine, but a character in the drama of expansion. And as railways spread, as they became familiar, almost mundane, their revolutionary nature could be overlooked, easy to forget that within a living memory, travel had been limited to the speed of horses, that what the railway enabled, this casual traversing of distance, would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations, the ability to travel 100 miles in a few hours, to cross entire countries in days rather than weeks, represented a fundamental break with all previous human experience of space and time. The late 19th century saw locomotives grow larger still, more powerful, capable of hauling longer trains, heavier loads, freight locomotives with many driving wheels for traction, passenger locomotives with large drivers for speed, specialized designs for mountain grades, for suburban service, for switching in yards, the locomotive evolving into many forms, each adapted to particular tasks, particular conditions, and the technology continued to advance. Compound expansion, using steam multiple times at decreasing pressures, extracting more work from each pound of coal burned, superheating, raising steam temperature beyond what was produced in the boiler, increasing efficiency, these refinements making locomotives more economical, more capable, though always within the same basic paradigm, the steam locomotive, burning coal or later oil, boiling water to produce steam, using that steam's expansion to drive pistons, to turn wheels, to pull trains along rails of iron and later steel. But even as steam reached its peak, even as the locomotives became magnificent machines, powerful and fast and beautifully engineered, the seeds of their obsolescence were being planted. Electric locomotives appeared in the late 1800s, drawing power from overhead wires or third rails, clean, quiet, instantly responsive, and diesel engines, internal combustion machines burning oil rather than coal, began to be adapted for railway use, offering advantages in efficiency, in maintenance, in operational flexibility. The transition would be gradual. Steam locomotives would remain dominant well into the 20th century, in some places into the 1960s and even 70s. But the era of steam, the age that had begun with Trevithick and Stephenson, was slowly drawing to a close. Diesel and electric traction proving superior in most applications, more economical, more suited to the demands of modern railway operation. And yet, the steam locomotive, even in retirement, even as museum pieces or heritage railway attractions, retained a hold on the imagination. Something about the visible operation, the smoke and steam, the rhythm of the exhaust, the sense of fire and water transformed into motion, spoke to something deep, a fascination with power made manifest, with human ingenuity wrestling the elements into service. The story of the locomotive is, in many ways, the story of the 19th century itself, of industrialization, of the transformation of society from agricultural and craft-based to urban and mechanized, of the acceleration of life, the compression of distance, the creation of networks that bound nations and continents into single systems of commerce and communication, from those early experimental engines, unreliable and crude, to the magnificent express locomotives of the early 20th century, capable of sustained speeds over 100 miles per hour, represented less than a century of development, an astonishingly rapid evolution driven by competition, by economic incentive, by the accumulated knowledge of thousands of engineers and craftsmen, each contributing improvements, refinements, solutions to the endless challenges of making these machines more powerful, more reliable, more economical, and in that development, in that rapid transformation of technology and society, we can see patterns that would repeat: the initial skepticism giving way to enthusiasm, the infrastructure adapting to accommodate the new technology, the social and economic structures reorganizing around new possibilities, the landscape itself transformed, scarred by cuttings and embankments, bridged by viaducts, tunneled through mountains, all to create smooth paths for wheels of iron carrying their heavy loads. The locomotive changed what it meant to travel, what it meant to send goods to market, what it meant to live in one place and work in another. It made suburbs possible, made fresh food available year-round in cities, made tourism accessible to the middle classes, made migration easier, both within countries and between them. It was both servant and shaper of the industrial age, responding to its needs while simultaneously creating new possibilities, new patterns of life and commerce that hadn't existed before, couldn't have existed before. These machines made them real. And perhaps what's most striking when we consider the locomotive from this distance is how thoroughly it represented a shift in human relationship with power itself. For millennia, power had meant muscle, human or animal, or it had meant natural forces harnessed passively, wind-filling sails, water-turning wheels, forces borrowed but not fundamentally transformed. But the locomotive, the steam engine more broadly, represented something different: the deliberate, controlled, sustained conversion of chemical energy into mechanical work, humans learning to unlock the ancient sunlight stored in coal, to release it not in a single burst like gunpowder, but gradually, continuously, under control, feeding it into motion, into the turning of wheels, into useful work performed hour after hour, day after day. This was alchemy of a sort, not the medieval dream of turning lead to gold, but something perhaps more profound, turning heat into motion, understanding the principles deeply enough to design vessels that could contain the pressures, mechanisms that could channel the forces, systems that could regulate and sustain the process without destroying themselves in the attempt. And in learning to do this, in mastering steam, engineers were also learning thermodynamics, the science of heat and energy. Even before the formal laws were articulated, they were discovering through trial and error, through careful measurement and observation, the principles that govern how energy flows, how efficiency can be improved, how waste can be minimized. Practical knowledge preceding theoretical understanding, hands teaching minds. The locomotive embodied paradoxes. It was both powerful and fragile, capable of pulling tremendous loads yet vulnerable to mechanical failure. A cracked cylinder, a leaking valve, a worn bearing could disable a machine that otherwise seemed almost invincible. And so reliability became as important as power. consistency as valuable as peak performance. The machine that worked day after day, year after year, proving more useful than one that achieved spectacular results, but frequently failed. There was beauty in them, too, not always recognized in their working days when they were simply tools, machines doing jobs, but beauty nonetheless in the proportion of driving wheels to boiler, in the arrangement of motion, connecting rods and valve gear, moving in precise choreography, every component serving its function while creating patterns of movement that please the eye, function and form unified, engineering as a kind of sculpture, though sculpture that happened to move, to breathe steam, to pull trains across continents, and the sounds, the particular music of steam locomotion, the chuff of exhaust synchronized with wheel rotation, varying in tempo as speed increased or decreased, the hiss of steam escaping from cylinders, the clank of couplings taking up slack, the whistle, that distinctive voice announcing approach, warning of crossings, expressing in its variations something almost like emotion, triumph, warning, farewell, each whistle unique, each locomotive recognizable by those who knew them, by the engine men who spent their working lives in intimate contact with these machines. For there was a craft to operating a locomotive, a skill that went beyond simply understanding the controls. Experienced engine men could feel their machine, sense when something wasn't quite right. Hear in the exhaust note or the rhythm of motion that a bearing was running hot or a valve needed adjustment. They knew their engines individually, knew how this particular locomotive liked to be fired, how that one needed careful handling on curves, knowledge that came from hours and years of experience, of attention paid to the subtle variations that made each machine unique, despite superficial similarity, and the firemen who shoveled coal into fireboxes learned to read the fire, to know when it needed fresh fuel, where to place the coal for even burning, how to maintain steam pressure through varying demands, climbing grades that required maximum power, descending where steam could be conserved, the firebox, a living thing requiring constant attention, constant feeding, the work physical, demanding, hot, exhausting, but skilled nonetheless, an art developed through practice and observation and the tutelage of those who had mastered it before. The railway culture that developed around locomotives was distinct, its own hierarchy, its own traditions, its own vocabulary, a world of engine men and firemen, of cleaners who maintained the machines between runs, of fitters who repaired them, of shed foremen who supervised operations, of the mystique of the footplate, the locomotive cab, where only the initiated were permitted, where speed and power were controlled, where decisions made in moments could mean the difference between smooth operation and disaster. And disasters there were: boiler explosions, collisions, derailments. The price of power was risk, and the history of railways includes tragedy as well as triumph, accidents that killed crew and passengers, that destroyed locomotives and infrastructure, and from each disaster, lessons learned, safety systems developed, automatic brakes, block signaling, dead man's controls, the gradual accretion of safeguards that made railway travel safer, more reliable, though never entirely without danger, never entirely predictable, the price of motion through space at speeds nature never intended for human bodies. Yet people accepted these risks, embraced railway travel despite occasional catastrophes, because the benefits were overwhelming: the compression of distance, the accessibility of places formerly remote, the economic opportunities created by cheap, fast transport. These outweighed the dangers, just as people later would accept the risks of automobile travel, of aviation, trading safety for mobility, for the expansion of possibility that rapid transport enables. The locomotive's influence extended beyond transportation. It shaped architecture, great railway stations becoming civic monuments, hotels built near terminals, entire neighborhoods developing around railway works and depots, cities reorganizing themselves around railway access, property values rising near stations, declining in areas the railways bypassed, geography remade by iron roads, and it influenced culture, literature filled with railway journeys, poetry celebrating or lamenting the iron horse, paintings capturing the drama of locomotives in motion, the romance of departure, the melancholy of arrival, the railway becoming symbol, metaphor for progress, for modernity, for the relentless forward movement of industrial civilization, or alternatively, for destruction of pastoral landscapes, for the mechanization of life, for speed pursued at the expense of contemplation, the locomotive meaning different things to different observers, but meaning something to all, too significant, too transformative to ignore. In the quiet of tonight, thinking about these machines, about their rise and their gradual replacement by newer technologies, there's something almost poignant, the way they embodied an entire era, the way their decline marked the end of something, not just a technology, but a relationship with technology, visible, comprehensible, driven by fire and water, by principles a dedicated observer could understand just by watching, unlike the electric motors and diesel engines that replaced them, closed systems, their operation invisible, mysterious, efficient, but less engaging to human imagination. Perhaps that's why preserved steam locomotives, heritage railways, enthusiast groups maintain such dedication to keeping these machines alive, running them on special occasions, maintaining the skills required to operate them, not from nostalgia alone, though nostalgia plays its part, but from recognition that something valuable exists in the direct, visible, almost organic operation of a steam locomotive, the sense of connection between fuel and fire and steam and motion, a chain of causation you can observe, can feel, can understand in your body as well as your mind. The story of the locomotive is complete now, in the sense that its era has passed. The last regular steam operations ended decades ago in most of the world, and yet the story persists in the railways that still crisscross continents, running on the gauges Stephenson standardized, following routes Victorian engineers surveyed, through tunnels they excavated, over viaducts they built, infrastructure that outlasted the technology it was created for, serving new purposes, electric and diesel traction following paths laid down for steam, the locomotive's legacy embedded in landscape, in the very geography of movement, and on still nights, in certain places, you can sometimes hear a whistle, a heritage railway running an excursion, or the echo of memory, or imagination filling the silence, the sound carrying across distance, announcing motion, departure, the endless human impulse to go, to see what lies beyond the horizon, to connect, to trade, to visit, to explore, the locomotive having made that impulse more achievable, more routine, more democratically available than ever before in human history. Steam and iron expanding the radius of possible lives, of achievable dreams, of connections that could be made and maintained across distances that would have divided people in earlier times. The fire burns down eventually. In every firebox, steam pressure drops, wheels roll to a stop, and the crew climbs down from the footplate, their shift complete. But the rails remain, stretching toward horizons, waiting for the next departure, the next journey, the pattern established, the infrastructure enduring, the revolution the locomotive created, irreversible, permanent, woven into the fabric of how we organize ourselves across space, how we think about distance, how we live in a world made smaller, more intimate, more connected by those parallel lines of steel, and the machines that first proved they could be more than tramways for horses, could be arteries of commerce and culture, pathways for the transformation of everything they touched. And so the story rests, not ended but paused, the locomotives mostly still now, preserved, remembered, honored for what they accomplished, for how they changed the world, for the beauty they embodied, for the skills they required, for the era they defined, standing in museums or running occasionally on heritage lines, ambassadors from a vanished age, reminders of what can be achieved when vision meets determination, when engineering serves human needs, when innovation transforms not just technology, but society itself, the locomotive, first machine to move itself, to carry humanity into modernity, to prove that distance could be conquered, time compressed, the world made navigable in ways previously unimaginable, its work complete, its legacy enduring, its story told. The night deepens, and somewhere in memory or imagination, a whistle sounds faint, distant, carrying across years as once it carried across miles. The voice of the locomotive, calling, fading, becoming part of the silence from which it emerged, part of history, part of the long dream of progress and transformation, part of us forever. There is a kind of stillness that settles over the world when familiar things begin to shimmer, when what seemed solid reveals itself to be something else entirely, something vast and uncertain and strangely beautiful. Tonight, I find myself drawn into that shimmer, into the heart of a revolution that began not with thunder, but with whispers, quiet observations in laboratories lit by gas lamps and gentle lamplight, questions asked in the margins of equations, puzzles that refuse to behave. The quantum world, this realm beneath the surface of everything we touch and see, didn't announce itself with fanfare. It crept into human awareness slowly, reluctantly, like morning mist revealing an unfamiliar landscape that had been there all along. I imagine walking through a museum late in the evening when the crowds have dispersed and the halls echo with footsteps that aren't quite my own. The exhibits here are not paintings or sculptures, but ideas, fragile and revolutionary, mounted carefully behind glass. In the first room, there is darkness, the comfortable darkness of the 19th century, when matter seemed dependable, when atoms, if they existed at all, were thought to be tiny billiard balls, solid and predictable, rolling through space according to laws that felt almost musical in their precision. But even then, even in that confident age, There were cracks forming, anomalies that didn't fit the elegant theories, light that behaved strangely when passed through prisms, metals that glowed with colors that shifted as they grew hotter, radiation pouring from substances that seemed to burn without fuel or flame. I can almost see the laboratories of that time, wooden benches cluttered with glass apparatus, the sharp smell of chemicals, the scratch of pen on paper as someone records an observation that refuses to make sense. Again and again, the same impossible result. The quantum story begins, I think, in the borderlands between light and heat, in the strange glow of objects warming in furnaces, black body radiation, they called it, this light emitted by heated objects, and it should have been simple, a smooth curve rising and falling according to well-understood principles, but it wasn't simple. The equations broke down, predicting infinite energy at certain wavelengths, an ultraviolet catastrophe that would have meant the universe consuming itself in radiation, and yet the universe remained calm and indifferent to the mathematics that tried to describe it. Someone had to step into that contradiction to suggest something uncomfortable, something that violated every intuition about how nature should work. Energy, perhaps, didn't flow smoothly like water. Perhaps it came in packets, discrete bundles, quanta, the way coins are separate from one another, even though we imagine money as a continuous quantity. It was 1899 turning into 1900, a threshold between centuries, and Max Planck, working in Berlin, introduced this idea almost apologetically as a mathematical trick, a convenience that happened to match the experimental data. He didn't believe it was real, not at first, not in his bones, but the quantum had arrived, whether anyone believed in it or not. I imagine those early years as a landscape where the ground beneath everyone's feet had become uncertain, where stepping forward required a kind of courage that had nothing to do with physical danger and everything to do with releasing certainty, letting go of the world as it had always been understood. Light itself became the next mystery, the next impossible thing. For centuries, light had been argued over. Was it wave or particle, undulation in some invisible medium, or a stream of tiny projectiles fired across space? By the late 19th century, the wave theory seemed to have won. Experiments showed interference patterns, diffraction, all the hallmarks of waves spreading and overlapping. And yet, when light struck certain metals, it knocked electrons loose. And the details of this photoelectric effect made no sense if light was purely a wave. The energy of the ejected electrons depended on the color of the light, not its intensity. Bright red light did nothing, while dim violet light freed electrons immediately. Albert Einstein, still unknown, working in a patent office in Bern, read Planck's work and took it seriously, more seriously perhaps than Planck himself. In 1905, that miraculous year, Einstein proposed that light itself was quantized, that it traveled in packets, photons, each carrying a specific amount of energy determined by its frequency, its color, the wave-particle duality. This impossible doubleness had entered the world. I think of how it must have felt to be young and unknown and certain of something the entire scientific establishment considered absurd, to write papers in spare moments, and to know somehow that the universe was stranger and more beautiful than anyone had dared imagine. The quantum world was opening like a flower in the dark, petal by petal, revealing symmetries no one had expected and contradictions no one knew how to resolve. The story gathers momentum now, like water finding its path downhill, inevitable, unstoppable, though no one at the time could have predicted where it would lead. Niels Bohr arrives in this narrative like a character stepping onto a stage, a young Danish physicist with a football player's build and a philosopher's temperament, drawn to England, to the laboratories where atoms were being probed and questioned. In 1911, he found himself in Ernest Rutherford's lab in Manchester, where experiments had recently shattered the comfortable image of atoms as solid spheres. Rutherford had fired particles at gold foil, expecting them to pass through with barely a deflection, like bullets through tissue paper. But some particles bounced straight back, impossibly, as if they'd struck something incredibly dense and small, a nucleus, a tiny core at the atom's heart, with electrons somehow orbiting around it, like planets around a distant sun. The planetary model was beautiful, intuitive, and completely unstable according to classical physics. Orbiting electrons should radiate energy continuously, spiraling inward in a fraction of a second, collapsing into the nucleus in a catastrophic rush. Yet atoms persisted, stable, emitting light only at specific frequencies, like musical instruments that could play only certain notes. Never the tones in between. Bohr took the quantum idea, still strange and uncomfortable, and applied it with daring simplicity. What if electrons could orbit only at certain distances, certain energy levels, and nowhere in between? What if they jumped from one orbit to another instantaneously, without passing through the space between emitting or absorbing a photon with each quantum leap? The Bohr model emerged in 1913, and suddenly the spectrum of hydrogen made sense. Those precise lines of color, those forbidden wavelengths, they were the signatures of electrons jumping between allowed orbits, climbing and falling through discrete steps. It was a hybrid thing, this model, part classical, part quantum, a bridge between worlds, and it worked, at least for hydrogen, predicting spectral lines with stunning accuracy. But it was also clearly incomplete, a sketch rather than a portrait, and Bohr knew it, even as others celebrated his success. He understood that deeper principles waited to be discovered. The First World War interrupted everything, scattering scientists across battlefields and weapons laboratories, turning minds that had contemplated the nature of light toward poison gas and explosives. The quantum revolution paused, held its breath, while the world tore itself apart. When the war ended, a generation emerged traumatized, disillusioned, ready to question everything, including the foundations of knowledge itself. And quantum mechanics found fertile ground in that soil of uncertainty. The early 1920s brought a strange parade of discoveries, each more peculiar than the last. Louis de Broglie, a French aristocrat turned physicist, proposed in 1923 that if light could behave as both wave and particle, perhaps matter could do the same. Perhaps electrons, previously thought of as tiny particles, also had a wavelength, a wave nature. It seemed absurd. Matter waves, but the mathematics was elegant, and when experiments were finally performed, firing electrons at crystals, they produced interference patterns, the unmistakable signature of waves. Matter itself was blurring, becoming uncertain. Wolfgang Pauli, brilliant and caustic, tormented by his own precision, discovered in 1924 that no two electrons could occupy the same quantum state simultaneously, the exclusion principle, a rule that had no classical analog, nothing in the familiar world to compare it to, and yet this principle explained the entire periodic table, the architecture of chemistry, why atoms built up in shells, why elements had the properties they did. The old quantum theory, with its mixture of classical orbits and quantum jumps, was clearly breaking down, giving correct answers for the wrong reasons, or for no comprehensible reason at all. Something more fundamental was needed. I imagine the state of mind in those years, the confusion mixed with exhilaration, working with tools that functioned but made no sense, like using a machine whose workings were hidden, whose outputs were reliable, but whose mechanism remained mysterious. Two young men, barely in their 20s, would break through the confusion almost simultaneously, approaching from different directions, finding the same truth beneath different mathematical languages. Werner Heisenberg, intense, allergic to pollen and philosophy in equal measure, working on the island of Helgoland in the spring of 1925 to escape hay fever, abandoned all attempts to visualize atomic processes. He stopped trying to picture electrons in orbits, stopped asking what they looked like or where they were. Instead, he focused only on observable quantities, on the light emitted or absorbed, on the frequencies and intensities that could actually be measured, and he constructed a mathematical framework, matrix mechanics, where physical quantities became tables of numbers, matrices that didn't commute, where the order of multiplication mattered. It was abstract, austere, almost violently divorced from intuition, and it worked. It predicted the hydrogen spectrum, the helium spectrum, phenomena that had resisted all previous attempts at explanation. Almost simultaneously, Erwin Schrödinger, older, steeped in classical physics and philosophy, took de Broglie's matter waves seriously. He asked what equation these waves might obey, and in an extraordinary burst of creativity over the Christmas holiday of 1925, staying at a villa in the Alps with a mysterious companion whose identity he never revealed, he derived his wave equation. The Schrödinger equation was beautiful, familiar in form, resembling wave equations from classical physics, and when applied to the hydrogen atom, it produced the same energy levels, the same spectral lines as Bohr's model, but derived from deeper principles, from a wave function that somehow encoded everything that could be known about a quantum system. For a brief moment, it seemed that the quantum world might be tamed, reduced to waves, strange waves perhaps, but waves nonetheless, something physicists could visualize and understand. But the wave function itself was peculiar. It wasn't a physical wave in space. It lived in an abstract mathematical realm, and for systems with multiple particles, it existed in high-dimensional spaces that couldn't be visualized at all. And then there was the question of what the wave function meant, what it represented. Schrödinger thought perhaps it described a smeared-out electron spread through space like a cloud, but that interpretation crumbled under scrutiny. When electrons were detected, they always appeared as points, never smeared, never divided. Max Born, working in Göttingen, proposed the answer that would become orthodox. The wave function didn't represent physical reality directly. It represented probability, the probability of finding an electron at a particular location if you looked. The act of measurement somehow collapsed the wave function, forcing the electron to choose a definite position from among the many possibilities it had embodied. This was disturbing, measurement creating reality rather than revealing it, observation playing an active role rather than remaining passive. The quantum world seemed to exist in a haze of possibility until someone looked at it. Heisenberg pushed further, examining the process of measurement itself, asking what it meant to determine an electron's position or momentum, and he discovered in 1927 his famous uncertainty principle, not merely a limitation of experimental technique, but a fundamental feature of nature. The more precisely you determined a particle's position, the less precisely you could know its momentum, and vice versa. There was a trade-off, an irreducible uncertainty, encoded in the mathematics, guaranteed by the non-commuting nature of quantum operators. It wasn't that the electron had a definite position and momentum that we simply couldn't measure. It was that these properties didn't exist simultaneously in the way classical physics assumed. Asking for both was like asking whether a wave was more fundamentally at a point or spread out. The question itself was wrong. The Copenhagen interpretation crystallized around Bohr and Heisenberg in those years, a philosophical framework for understanding or accepting the strangeness. It held that quantum mechanics was complete, that the probabilistic nature wasn't hiding some deeper deterministic reality, and that the act of measurement was fundamental, collapsing possibilities into actualities. Bohr spoke of complementarity, the idea that wave and particle were complementary descriptions, mutually exclusive but both necessary, like two languages describing the same ineffable thing. You could use one or the other depending on your experimental setup, but never both simultaneously. The mathematics worked flawlessly. Predictions matched experiments with extraordinary precision, but the meaning remained elusive, slippery. Different physicists held different interpretations, argued late into the night, and still went to their laboratories the next morning to calculate and measure. Not everyone accepted the new orthodoxy. Albert Einstein, by now famous, venerated, found the probabilistic interpretation deeply unsatisfying. He couldn't believe that God played dice with the universe, that nature was fundamentally indeterminate. Surely, he thought, quantum mechanics was incomplete, a statistical description of some deeper reality where particles had definite properties even when unobserved. The great debates began, Einstein versus Bohr, carried on in letters and lectures and the famous Solvay conferences where the greatest minds gathered. Einstein would propose thought experiments designed to show contradictions or incompleteness in quantum mechanics, and Bohr would respond, often staying up all night to find the flaw in Einstein's reasoning. The subtle way quantum principles preserved consistency. In 1935, Einstein, working with Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, published a paper describing what seemed like a fatal problem, a paradox. If quantum mechanics was complete and two particles became entangled, correlated in their quantum states, then measuring one particle would instantly determine the state of the other, no matter how far apart they were, faster than light. Spooky action at a distance, Einstein called it. Surely this proved quantum mechanics was incomplete. Surely particles had hidden properties all along. Bohr defended quantum mechanics, arguing that entangled particles couldn't be treated as separate systems, that the whole was more fundamental than the parts, but the issue remained unresolved, a philosophical puzzle rather than an experimental question, or so it seemed for decades. The foundations were laid now, the mathematical structure complete, even if its interpretation remained contested, and attention turned from philosophy to application, from asking what quantum mechanics meant to asking what it could do. The 1930s and 40s became a golden age of application, quantum mechanics transforming from philosophical puzzle into practical tool. The Schrödinger equation could be solved, approximately at first, then with increasing sophistication for atoms and molecules, revealing the architecture of chemical bonds, the dance of electrons that held matter together. Paul Dirac had already unified quantum mechanics with special relativity in 1928, deriving an equation that naturally produced electron spin and predicted antimatter, a mirror world of particles with opposite charge. The positron was discovered 4 years later, exactly as Dirac's mathematics foretold, reality conforming to the equations with almost magical precision. I think of those years as a time when the periodic table finally made sense, when chemists could understand why carbon formed 4 bonds, why noble gases refused to react, why metals conducted electricity while insulators didn't, all of it flowing from the wave functions of electrons, from the exclusion principle and the quantum rules governing their behavior. The atomic nucleus itself became a new frontier. Neutrons were discovered in 1932 by James Chadwick, and suddenly the nucleus wasn't just protons packed impossibly close. It contained neutrons too, neutral particles bound by a force stronger than electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, operating only at distances smaller than an atomic nucleus. Quantum mechanics explained radioactive decay, the way uranium nuclei spontaneously split, alpha particles tunneling through energy barriers they shouldn't classically be able to surmount. Quantum tunneling, another impossibility made routine, particles passing through walls by existing as waves, materializing on the other side. When nuclear fission was discovered in 1938, when Lisa Meitner and Otto Frisch realized that uranium nuclei could split into lighter elements, releasing enormous energy, the quantum world suddenly had geopolitical implications. The mathematics of wave functions and probability amplitudes became entangled with the machinery of war. The Manhattan Project pulled physicists from universities and laboratories, set them to work calculating neutron cross-sections, chain reaction dynamics, the critical mass needed for a uranium or plutonium bomb, quantum mechanics, barely 20 years old as a complete theory, was being used to design weapons of unprecedented destructive power. I imagine the strange doubling of consciousness this must have required, working with equations of extraordinary beauty, describing the most fundamental aspects of nature, while knowing the purpose was to incinerate cities, to force matter to release the binding energy that held nuclei together. After the war ended, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the physicists scattered again, many returning to pure research, carrying guilt and knowledge in equal measure, and quantum mechanics entered a new phase, simultaneously celebrated and applied with little concern for the interpretational puzzles that had so troubled the founders. Solid-state physics emerged as a discipline, applying quantum mechanics to crystals, to the regular arrays of atoms in metals and semiconductors, understanding how electrons moved through these structures, why some materials conducted, others insulated, still others fell somewhere in between. The transistor was invented at Bell Labs in 1947, a quantum mechanical device exploiting the band structure of semiconductors, the way quantum mechanics created allowed and forbidden energy ranges for electrons in crystalline solids. Within a decade, transistors began replacing vacuum tubes, shrinking, becoming cheaper, more reliable, launching the electronics revolution that would reshape human civilization. Lasers followed in 1960. Light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation, another quantum phenomenon, atoms excited to higher energy states, then triggered to emit photons in perfect synchrony, coherent light, all the waves marching in lockstep, monochromatic, directional, intense enough to cut through steel or carry information through fiber optic cables. Every technology of the late 20th century rested on quantum foundations, even if engineers didn't always think in those terms. The computer on which designs were drafted, the sensors in medical imaging devices, the atomic clocks synchronizing GPS satellites, all depended on quantum behavior, on electrons and photons following rules that defied classical intuition. But beneath the applications, the interpretational questions remained, unresolved, occasionally surfacing in new forms. Hugh Everett, a graduate student at Princeton in the 1950s, proposed the most radical interpretation yet. What if the wave function never collapsed? What if every quantum measurement caused the universe to split, branching into parallel realities, one for each possible outcome? In one branch, the electron was measured here. In another branch there, both equally real, both continuing forward, a vast tree of bifurcating worlds growing with every quantum event. The many worlds interpretation, as it came to be called, was elegant mathematically. It took the Schrödinger equation completely seriously. No special role for measurement, no mysterious collapse, just unitary evolution, wave functions growing and branching. But the price was an infinity of universes, most of them forever inaccessible. And most physicists found the ontological extravagance too high a cost. Still, the idea persisted, gained adherence, especially as quantum computers began to be conceived, devices that could exploit superposition, holding qubits in combinations of 0 and 1 simultaneously, performing calculations on all possible inputs at once, in parallel, as if borrowing computational power from those other branches. David Bohm offered an alternative in the 1950s, a deterministic interpretation with hidden variables. Particles had definite positions always, guided by a quantum potential derived from the wave function, pilot wave theory. It reproduced all the predictions of standard quantum mechanics, but added an underlying reality, hidden from measurement but nonetheless present. Most physicists ignored Bohm's interpretation. It seemed baroque, adding elements that made no difference to experimental outcomes, violating Occam's razor. But it proved that deterministic alternatives to the Copenhagen interpretation were at least mathematically possible, even if they required faster-than-light influences to work. The real breakthrough in understanding came from an unexpected direction, from John Bell, a physicist at CERN, who in 1964 derived an inequality, a mathematical relationship that any theory based on local hidden variables would have to satisfy. Bell showed that Einstein's intuition, his belief that particles had definite properties before measurement and that no influence traveled faster than light, led to testable predictions, and those predictions differed from quantum mechanics for the first time. The interpretational debate could be settled by experiment rather than philosophy. It took decades for technology to advance sufficiently for experimenters to create pairs of entangled photons and measure their properties with enough precision. But in the 1980s, Alain Aspect and his colleagues in France performed the definitive tests, and quantum mechanics was vindicated. Bell's inequality was violated exactly as quantum theory predicted. Local hidden variables were ruled out. Either quantum mechanics involved faster-than-light influences, or particles truly didn't have definite properties before measurement, or reality was non-local in ways that defied classical imagination. The universe was genuinely stranger than Einstein had been willing to accept. The experiments on entanglement opened new vistas. If particles could be correlated across arbitrary distances, their quantum states linked in ways that defied spatial separation, perhaps this could be used not for communication. The laws of physics prevented sending messages via entanglement, but for other purposes: cryptography, computation, teleportation of quantum states. Quantum information theory emerged in the 1980s and 90s, treating quantum states as resources, asking what could be done with superposition and entanglement that classical physics couldn't achieve. Charles Bennett and Gilles Brassard showed that quantum mechanics enabled perfectly secure communication. Any eavesdropper would inevitably disturb the quantum states being transmitted, revealing their presence. Peter Shor discovered in 1994 that a quantum computer could factor large numbers exponentially faster than any classical algorithm, threatening the cryptographic systems that secured internet commerce. Suddenly, quantum computing shifted from curiosity to urgent research priority. Governments and corporations poured resources into building devices that could maintain quantum coherence, preserving superposition long enough to perform useful calculations. The technical challenges were immense. Quantum states were fragile. The slightest interaction with the environment caused decoherence, superpositions collapsing into mixtures, quantum information leaking away as heat and noise. Maintaining a qubit required isolating it nearly perfectly, cooling it to millikelvin temperatures, shielding it from stray electromagnetic fields and vibrations. Yet progress came. First a handful of qubits, then dozens, ion traps holding charged atoms suspended in electromagnetic fields, superconducting circuits etched onto silicon chips, cooled until electrical resistance vanished and currents flowed without dissipation. Topological qubits exploiting exotic quantum states that were inherently protected from certain types of errors. I imagine the laboratories where this work proceeded. Dilution refrigerators maintaining temperatures colder than interstellar space, laser systems stabilized to fractional hertz, control electronics generating microwave pulses timed to picosecond precision, all to manipulate individual quantum systems, to choreograph their evolution, to read out their states without destroying the very information being sought. Quantum mechanics had come full circle from a theory that emerged reluctantly from puzzles about light and heat, through decades of philosophical controversy and stunning application, to a framework for entirely new technologies, devices that exploited the strangeness rather than fighting against it. That made superposition and entanglement into features rather than bugs. The condensed matter physicists, meanwhile, had been finding their own quantum wonders, superfluids that flowed without friction, superconductors that carried current without resistance, both phenomena requiring quantum coherence at macroscopic scales, millions of atoms acting in concert, their wave functions overlapping, becoming one giant quantum state. The fractional quantum Hall effect, discovered in 1982, revealed even stranger behavior. Electrons in strong magnetic fields organizing into states with fractional charge, quasi-particles emerging from collective behavior. Any ones with statistics neither bosonic nor fermionic, a bestiary of exotic quantum phases, topological states of matter that couldn't be characterized by symmetry breaking alone. Bose-Einstein condensates were finally created in 1995. Eric Cornell and Carl Wieman cooling rubidium atoms to billionths of a degree above absolute zero, watching them suddenly coalesce into a single quantum state, a droplet of a matter where all the atoms shared the same wave function, moving as one, exhibiting interference effects visible to the naked eye. These macroscopic quantum phenomena blurred the boundary between the quantum and classical worlds, showing that the strangeness wasn't confined to atoms and photons, that under the right condition, matter itself could enter quantum states, behaving coherently across distances large enough to see. The 21st century brought quantum mechanics into an era of precision and control. Individual atoms could be trapped and manipulated, photographed, made to interact in choreographed sequences, what had been statistical ensembles, billions of particles behaving on average according to quantum rules, became individual systems, each one a laboratory for testing the foundations of quantum theory. Quantum simulators emerged, systems of trapped ions or atoms in optical lattices, arranged to mimic other quantum systems too complex to calculate. You couldn't solve the Schrödinger equation for 100 interacting particles. The computational resources didn't exist, but you could build a physical system with the same Hamiltonian, the same energy structure, and watch it evolve, using one quantum system to understand another. High-energy physicists pushed quantum field theory to extraordinary precision, the Standard Model, describing all known particles and 3 of the 4 fundamental forces, made predictions accurate to 10 decimal places, the anomalous magnetic moment of the electron, the mass of the W boson, quantities measured and calculated with precision that seemed almost obscene. Nature and mathematics agreeing to 1 part in 10 billion. The Higgs boson was finally discovered in 2012 at CERN, the Large Hadron Collider smashing protons together at energies high enough to briefly create the particle, or rather the quantum field excitation, that gave other particles their mass. The last missing piece of the Standard Model, predicted in 1964, found 48 years later. Quantum field theory vindicated yet again. Yet even in triumph, puzzles remained: quantum mechanics and general relativity. The 2 pillars of 20th century physics refused to merge cleanly at the Planck scale, where quantum fluctuations of space-time itself should become important. The mathematics broke down. Infinities appeared that couldn't be removed. Space-time foam, quantum gravity, string theory, loop quantum gravity. Various approaches attempted to reconcile the theories, but no experimental evidence yet distinguished between them. Black holes became theaters for exploring the tension. Stephen Hawking showed in 1974 that quantum mechanics predicted black holes should radiate, slowly evaporating, and this raised paradoxes. Information falling into a black hole seemed to be destroyed, violating quantum mechanical unitarity, the principle that information is preserved. The black hole information paradox remained unresolved, with proposals ranging from firewalls at the event horizon to holographic principles where all the information was encoded on the surface. Cosmology, too, became quantum. The very early universe, fractions of a second after the Big Bang, existed in quantum states, superpositions of different geometries. And inflation theory suggested that quantum fluctuations, tiny variations in energy density, were stretched to cosmic scales, becoming the seeds of galaxies, the large-scale structure of the universe, everything we see, emerging from quantum uncertainty in the first moments of time. The cosmic microwave background radiation, mapped with increasing precision by satellites, showed patterns consistent with quantum fluctuations amplified by inflation. The universe itself bore the fingerprints of quantum mechanics, written across billions of light years in the faint temperature variations of primordial light. Meanwhile, quantum technologies matured from laboratory curiosities into commercial realities. Quantum key distribution systems secured communications for governments and financial institutions. Quantum sensors measured gravitational fields and magnetic fields with unprecedented sensitivity, enabling new forms of medical imaging, mineral prospecting, even the detection of hidden structures underground. Quantum computers reached 50, then 100 qubits, enough to perform specific calculations beyond the reach of classical supercomputers. Quantum supremacy, or quantum advantage, the milestone where quantum devices definitively outperformed their classical counterparts, was achieved and contested and achieved again, the definition shifting as classical algorithms improved and quantum devices grew more sophisticated. Google announced quantum supremacy in 2019. IBM disputed the claim, arguing their classical supercomputers could match the result, but the trajectory was clear. Quantum computers were improving exponentially. Error correction schemes were being implemented, and applications beyond cryptography breaking were emerging. Quantum chemistry simulations, optimization problems, machine learning algorithms that could exploit quantum parallelism. The interpretation question, the meaning of quantum mechanics, never entirely disappeared. It periodically resurged, taking new forms as experimental capabilities expanded. Weak measurement theory allowed glimpses of quantum systems without fully collapsing their states, giving paradoxical results that different interpretations explained differently. The delayed choice quantum eraser, experiments where future measurements seemed to retroactively determine the past behavior of particles, challenged naive notions of causality, forcing careful distinction between correlation and causation, between what happened and what could be known. Quantum Darwinism emerged as a framework, explaining how the classical world emerged from quantum substrate through interaction with the environment. Certain states, pointer states, were robust against decoherence, preferentially surviving, while superpositions fragmented. This explained why we saw definite outcomes, why cats were alive or dead, but never both. The environment constantly measuring, selecting, amplifying certain quantum states into classical reality. Relational quantum mechanics proposed that quantum states were always relative to an observer, that there was no absolute wave function, only descriptions from within the universe, no view from nowhere. Every measurement was a physical interaction, creating correlations, and different observers could give different but equally valid descriptions of the same quantum system. I think of how the interpretations multiplied. Copenhagen, many worlds, Bohm, cubism, treating quantum states as subjective degrees of belief, consistent histories, spontaneous collapse theories, adding stochastic elements to the Schrödinger equation, each interpretation empirically equivalent, making the same predictions, yet carving reality at different joints, suggesting different ontologies. Perhaps this plurality was itself meaningful. Perhaps quantum mechanics was telling us that reality didn't conform to our classical categories, that insisting on a single interpretation missed the point, that complementarity extended beyond wave-particle duality to interpretational pluralism, different frameworks useful in different contexts, none capturing the full truth. The philosophical implications rippled outward into questions of consciousness, some arguing that the measurement problem required conscious observers, others that quantum mechanics in the brain might explain free will or qualia, most physicists skeptical, finding no evidence that consciousness played any special role in quantum mechanics, but the speculation persisted, fed by the genuine mystery of how subjective experience related to physical processes. Quantum biology emerged as a field, asking whether quantum coherence played functional roles in living systems. Photosynthesis seemed to involve quantum superposition, excitons exploring multiple pathways simultaneously, finding the most efficient route to the reaction center. Bird navigation might use entangled electron pairs in retinal proteins, sensitive to Earth's magnetic field. Though the evidence remained contested, the boundaries of quantum mechanics were being explored. How large could superpositions become before decoherence destroyed them? Molecules containing thousands of atoms had been put into superposition. Matter-wave interferometry with biological molecules, viruses. The quantum classical boundary seemed to be a matter of degree rather than kind. No sharp dividing line, just increasing fragility as systems grew larger and more complex. Macroscopic quantum tunneling was observed in superconducting circuits, billion-atom systems tunneling through energy barriers, switching between states in ways that seemed to violate classical mechanics, the strangeness scaling up, refusing to be confined to the microscopic realm. Gravity itself became a target for quantum experiments, measuring the gravitational field of small masses, asking whether gravity could create entanglement between particles, whether space-time curvature was compatible with quantum superposition. Proposed experiments to put mirrors in superposition and detect gravitational effects, pushing towards a regime where quantum mechanics and general relativity would both be necessary, testing whether they could coexist. The century that began with Planck's reluctant quantum hypothesis had produced a complete revolution. Quantum mechanics was now the foundation of chemistry, materials, science, electronics, computation, cryptography, metrology, fundamental physics, its predictions tested to extraordinary precision across dozens of orders of magnitude in energy and distance. Yet it remained, in some sense, inscrutable. The mathematics was clear, but the meaning, what it said about the nature of reality, remained contested. 100 years of debate had refined the questions without fully answering them. I imagine standing at this point in the narrative, looking back across decades of discovery, forward towards applications not yet conceived. Quantum mechanics, simultaneously the most successful and most mysterious theory in physics, precise beyond belief, strange beyond comprehension. The laboratory notebooks have become digital files. The equipment has grown from brass and glass to cryogenics and lasers. But the essential wonder remains that nature at its foundations refuses to be what we expected, refuses to conform to intuition built from everyday experience, and yet allows itself to be described, predicted, manipulated through mathematics of austere beauty. The quantum world is no longer inaccessible, hidden behind energy barriers and experimental limitations. It has become tangible, manipulable, a resource to be engineered, and yet its strangeness has not diminished. If anything, closer examination reveals new puzzles, new questions, new ways in which reality exceeds our categories. The deepening begins here, not with new facts, but with the resonance of what has been discovered. The way quantum mechanics has reshaped not just physics, but human understanding of what it means for something to exist. There is something profound in the uncertainty principle. Beyond its mathematical formulation, it suggests that nature at its foundations is not a collection of things with definite properties, but rather a web of potentialities, actualized only in relation to measurement, to interaction, to context. The electron orbiting an atom doesn't follow a path. It exists as a cloud of probability, a standing wave wrapped around the nucleus, and only when we look, when we measure, does it appear at a location, as if our looking calls it into being, though this anthropomorphizes what is really just interaction, entanglement between measuring device and measured system. This idea of relationality runs deep through quantum mechanics. Particles don't have intrinsic properties waiting to be discovered. They have dispositions, tendencies, correlations with other systems, and these correlations are fundamental, more basic than the individual elements being correlated. Entanglement demonstrates this most clearly. Two particles that have interacted can remain connected, their quantum states linked, such that measuring one instantaneously affects what can be said about the other, regardless of the distance separating them, not because information travels between them, but because they form a unified system, a single quantum state that cannot be decomposed into independent parts. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, and it troubled him deeply, but experiments have confirmed it beyond doubt. The correlations are real. They violate Bell's inequalities. They exceed what any local hidden variable theory could produce. The quantum world is fundamentally non-local, holistic, resistant to reductionist decomposition. This non-locality doesn't allow faster-than-light communication. The randomness of quantum measurement outcomes ensures that, but it suggests something radical about the nature of space itself. Perhaps distance is not as fundamental as we imagine. Perhaps at the quantum level, spatially separated systems can remain intimately connected, woven together in ways that classical physics never anticipated. The wave of function collapse, that moment when quantum superposition gives way to definite outcomes, remains mysterious even after a century. Different interpretations offer different accounts, but all must grapple with the transition from many possibilities to one actuality, from potentiality to reality. In many worlds, there is no collapse, just branching. All outcomes occur. Consciousness splitting along with the universe, experiencing one branch while other versions experience the others. It's a view both extravagant and austere, extravagant in its ontology, austere in its mathematics, taking the Schrödinger equation completely seriously with no additional postulates. In Copenhagen, collapse is fundamental but mysterious. Measurement is primitive, not further analyzable. This seems unsatisfying, leaving the quantum classical boundary undefined, but it has the virtue of matching how physicists actually work, calculating probabilities, making measurements, updating their knowledge based on outcomes. In quantum Darwinism and decoherence theory, collapse emerges from interaction with environment. Superpositions don't disappear. They become entangled with countless environmental degrees of freedom, scattered into inaccessibility. What looks like collapse from within is actually the growth of correlation, information spreading outward, becoming classical through redundancy. Each interpretation carves reality differently, yet all agree on predictions, on what observers will experience. This empirical equivalence might itself be telling us something, that our questions about what quantum mechanics really means presuppose classical metaphysics, categories that don't apply. Asking which interpretation is true might be like asking whether light is really waves or really particles. The question assumes nature must conform to our categories, when perhaps it doesn't. The mathematics of quantum mechanics has its own kind of beauty. Hilbert spaces, unitary transformations, eigenvalues and eigenvectors. It's the geometry of possibility. And there's something profound in how physical laws can be expressed in this abstract mathematical language, how the structure of quantum theory seems almost inevitable once you accept certain basic principles: linearity, unitarity, the Born rule for probabilities. Symmetry plays a central role. Quantum mechanics respects certain symmetries: rotational invariance, time translation, and each symmetry corresponds to a conservation law, angular momentum, energy. This deep connection between symmetry and conservation, discovered by Emmy Noether, extends from classical to quantum physics, suggesting that symmetry is somehow fundamental to the structure of physical law. The gauge theories that describe fundamental forces, electromagnetism, weak nuclear force, strong nuclear force, are all quantum theories built on symmetry principles. Local gauge invariance, the requirement that physics be unchanged by certain transformations, leads inevitably to the existence of force-carrying particles, photons, W and Z bosons, gluons, symmetry, generating reality. There's a kind of Platonic quality to this, the sense that mathematical structure determines physical reality, that the universe is comprehensible because it embodies mathematical relationships. Quantum mechanics pushes this further than classical physics ever did, replacing visualizable mechanisms with abstract operators and state vectors. And yet this abstraction is not emptiness. It describes nature with uncanny precision: the measurement problem, the interpretation questions, the philosophical puzzles. None of these diminish the practical success of quantum mechanics. Engineers designing quantum computers don't need to resolve whether many worlds is true. Chemists calculating molecular structures don't worry about collapse. The theory works, and that pragmatic success has driven a century of technological transformation. Yet the questions persist, because human beings want more than prediction. We want understanding. We want to know what the universe is like, not just how it behaves. And quantum mechanics frustrates this desire, offering mathematical certainty while withholding ontological clarity. Perhaps that frustration is itself a lesson, teaching us that reality at its foundations is not picturable, not reducible to mechanical models, that the universe is genuinely stranger than our evolved intuitions can grasp, and that mathematics, abstraction, is our best guide through territories where visualization fails. The quantum realm is not separate from the everyday world. It is the everyday world seen more clearly. Electrons and atoms obey quantum mechanics, and atoms compose everything we touch: the solidity of matter, the colors of objects, the flow of electricity, all quantum phenomena. We live immersed in quantum mechanics, our very existence dependent on exclusion principle, on tunneling, on the quantum rules governing chemical bonds. Consciousness itself, whatever it is, emerges from quantum mechanical processes in neurons, from ion channels and neurotransmitters and electrical signals, all obeying Schrödinger's equation, though the connection between those physical processes and subjective experience remains mysterious. The hard problem of consciousness intersecting with the measurement problem in ways no one has resolved. The story of quantum mechanics is unfinished. Experiments continue. Quantum gravity remains elusive. The interpretation debate goes on. New applications emerge. But something fundamental has been learned, something about the limits of human intuition, the power of mathematics, the strangeness of nature. We began in darkness, in the comfortable certainty of classical physics, and quantum mechanics led us into a stranger land, where particles are waves, where observation affects reality, where distant systems remain entangled, where uncertainty is fundamental. And yet, in that strangeness, we found precision, beauty, the foundations of modern technology, and perhaps a deeper truth about existence itself. The laboratories are quieting now, the experiments winding down, the calculations saved and filed away, but the quantum world continues, superpositions evolving, wave functions spreading, entanglement growing, all according to equations discovered by human minds, seeking to understand. In the stillness, I can almost hear it, the hum of the universe at its smallest scales, neither wave nor particle, but something else, something mathematics can describe, but words can barely capture, reality refusing our categories, insisting on its own strange terms. The textbooks will be written and rewritten, the courses taught, students puzzling over the double-slit experiment, the uncertainty principle, trying to reconcile what they're told with what they feel must be true, and gradually, perhaps, accepting that nature is under no obligation to match our intuitions. Quantum mechanics stands as both achievement and mystery, triumph and puzzle, the most successful physical theory ever devised, and the most philosophically perplexing. It has given us precision and wonder in equal measure, and after a century, its strangeness has not diminished. If anything, Deeper investigation reveals new layers of peculiarity, new ways in which reality exceeds expectation. The night deepens, and the quantum world persists, unchanged by our understanding or lack thereof. Electrons orbiting, photons propagating, wave functions evolving, all the strange machinery of existence, continuing its dance, indifferent to observation, yet somehow miraculously comprehensible, describable, predictable, through symbols on a page, through mathematics, through human thought, reaching toward the foundations of what is. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery. Not that quantum mechanics is strange, but that it can be known at all, that minds built from quantum particles, evolved to navigate a classical world, can nonetheless grasp the principles governing their own existence, can write equations that predict the behavior of electrons and photons, can build technologies exploiting quantum effects, can peer into the heart of matter and find not chaos, but law, not confusion, but structure, beautiful, terrible, strange, and somehow against all odds, intelligible. The words are fading now, dissolving like wave functions in an environment, spreading, entangling, becoming part of the larger system. And in that dissolution, there is something appropriate, something quantum, the boundaries between ideas becoming uncertain, the narrative itself entering superposition, neither quite finished nor continuing, both and neither, suspended in the space between, and the silence returns, deeper than before, carrying within it all that has been said, and all that remains unspeakable, the quantum world, vast and intimate, distant and immediate, forever strange, forever here, the ground beneath everything, including these words, including this moment, including the consciousness reading them, all of it quantum, all of it mystery, all of it precisely described and utterly inexplicable. And in that paradox, perhaps the deepest truth that we can know without fully understanding, that mathematics reaches where intuition fails, that the universe reveals itself in equations, even as it refuses to be visualized, to be grasped, to be anything other than what it impossibly is. I walk through a realm where sand holds memory, where stone speaks in silence, and where the passage of thousands of years feels less like distance and more like depth. The Nile moves as it has always moved, a ribbon of silver-green cutting through ochre and gold, and along its banks the air shimmers with a heat that seems to come not just from the sun overhead, but from the earth itself, as if the ground remembers every footstep, every offering, every whispered prayer that has ever touched it. In the stillness before dawn, when the darkness hasn't yet surrendered to light, there exists a particular quality of anticipation. The desert sky holds its breath, and the stars appear closer than they do anywhere else, as if they too are watching, waiting for what the new day might reveal. The temples rise from the landscape like thoughts made solid, their massive columns casting shadows that stretch and shift with the sun's journey. And within those shadows, within the cool stone interiors, where sunlight enters only in calculated shafts, there lingers something that feels almost like presence, almost like the accumulated weight of devotion, of ritual, of belief, practiced so continuously for so long that it seemed to saturate the very walls. I find myself drawn to a particular doorway, its frame carved with images that flow into one another without clear beginning or end, birds with human heads, figures bearing staffs and ankhs, processions that move eternally forward, yet somehow remain forever still, and the stone itself, smooth from centuries of hands, of fabric brushing past, of the quiet friction of daily reverence. Beyond the doorway, the light changes, becoming something softer, more diffuse, as if filtered through water or through the veil between what is seen and what is known. And in this altered luminosity, shapes resolve themselves slowly. A seated figure with the head of a jackal, a woman whose arms extend like wings, a man whose skin gleams with the blue-green of deep water. The air here carries a scent I cannot quite name, something of incense long since burned to nothing, something of oil pressed from flowers that may no longer grow, something of time itself, if time could be said to have a fragrance, dry and faintly sweet and impossibly ancient. On the walls, stories unfold in registers, horizontal bands of narrative that require the eye to move slowly, deliberately, from right to left, following journeys both earthly and celestial, and what emerges from these images is not chaos but order, not randomness but pattern, a universe understood as layers, as transformations, as cycles that turn and return like the wheel of stars overhead. There are jars here, sealed and labeled, containing substances whose purposes were recorded in scripts that flow like reeds bending in wind, and there are tools whose functions speak of care, of precision, of processes that could not be hurried, that required patience and timing and the kind of knowledge that gets transmitted not through books alone, but through demonstration, through apprenticeship, through the slow accumulation of understanding that comes only from repetition and attention. I notice the way the columns taper, the way the ceilings curve slightly, the way spaces are designed not just to enclose, but to direct, to guide the mind toward particular contemplations, particular orientations, and there is genius in this, a sophistication that reveals itself only gradually, only to those willing to stand still long enough to observe without rushing toward conclusion. The stone beneath my feet, worn smooth by centuries of processions, holds a coolness even in the day's heat, and walking upon it feels like moving through a text written in a language just beyond comprehension, where the meaning hovers at the edge of understanding, familiar yet foreign, accessible yet mysterious. In the distance, beyond the walls, the desert stretches in waves of dun and amber, an ocean of sand where the wind writes messages that erase themselves, where the horizon shimmers with mirages, and where the boundary between earth and sky becomes uncertain, becomes a place of merging, of transformation. And here, in this threshold, space between the monumental and the intimate, between the preserved and the lost, between what was and what remains, something whispers of a worldview so complete, so encompassing that it touched every aspect of existence, from the grandest cosmic principle down to the smallest daily gesture, from the movement of the sun across the sky to the preparation of bread, from the flooding of the river to the painting of a child's toy. This is where I begin, in this luminous quiet, among these patient stones, preparing to trace the contours of a vision that saw the visible and invisible as one continuous reality, that understood death not as ending but as doorway, that built eternity not in metaphor but in limestone and granite and gold. The beginning, if such a thing can be said to have a single point of origin, emerges from the mist of prehistory like islands appearing as floodwaters recede, and what we find in those earliest traces are not yet temples, not yet the grand cosmologies that would later crystallize into canonical form, but something more fundamental, more elemental, the first stirrings of pattern-seeking in a landscape that itself seemed to speak of cycles and returns. Before there was Egypt as a unified realm, before the double crown joined the red land and the black, there were communities scattered along the river's edge, and these communities, separated by desert and distance, each developed their own relationships with the forces that governed their existence, the sun that brought both life-giving warmth and deadly heat, the river that could nourish or destroy. The animals whose behavior seemed to follow laws both observable and mysterious. In the south, in the region that would become known as Upper Egypt, the people watched vultures circle in thermals above the cliffs and saw in these birds something of protection, something of maternal care in the way they tended their young. And so the vulture became associated with a goddess, with Nekhbet, whose wings would eventually spread across the brows of rulers, whose image would signify sovereignty over the southern lands. In the north, in the marshy delta where the river split into countless fingers reaching toward the sea, the cobra emerged as a symbol of power, of the dangerous and protective force that could strike with lethal precision, and Wadjet, the serpent goddess, came to embody the fierce guardianship of the northern territories. Her hood flared in eternal warning, her venom both curse and cure. But these were not yet the only divine forces recognized. Far from it, each town, each settlement, each community clustered around its particular bend in the river or its particular field or fishing ground, developed allegiance to local powers, to the crocodile who ruled the waters, to the ibis who waded in the shallows, to the falcon whose eyes could spot prey from heights unreachable by human sight. And here something crucial begins to reveal itself, something that would distinguish this emerging tradition from others. The tendency not to reject or suppress these local variations, but to accumulate them, to layer them, to allow multiple truths to coexist even when they seemed to contradict, so that later, much later, there would be not one creation story but several, not one path to the afterlife but many, not one supreme deity but rather a vast assembly of powers, each with their domains, their relationships, their particular myths and manifestations. In these early centuries of Pharaoh, before writing emerged to fix belief into text, the stories moved as stories do when carried only in memory and speech. They shifted, adapted, merged, and separated like the braided channels of the delta itself. A god from one village might be understood as the brother of a god from another, or as the same god wearing a different face, or as the enemy of that god, depending on the season, the crisis, the need of the moment. The dead were buried, as they had been for millennia, but slowly, gradually, the manner of burial began to change, to elaborate. Bodies that had once been placed in simple pits, wrapped perhaps in reed mats or animal skins, began to be accompanied by objects, a pot for water, a bowl for grain, tools that the person had used in life. And this shift, this beginning of grave goods, speaks to an emerging concept, that death was not cessation but transition, that the dead might still have needs, might still in some sense continue. The desert sand, hot and desiccating, naturally preserved bodies buried in shallow graves. And perhaps this is where the seed was planted, the observation that the dead need not decay into formlessness, that they could persist, could remain recognizably themselves, and if the body could be preserved, might not something else persist as well, some essential selfhood, some continuing awareness? By the time the first dynasty emerged, when a ruler named Narmer, or perhaps Menes, the histories blur and merge at this distance, unified the two lands into a single kingdom. The landscape was already populated with divine presences, already understood as a realm where the visible and invisible interpenetrated, where every element of the natural world could serve as manifestation of powers beyond human understanding. The king himself, this unifier, took on qualities that transcended the merely human. He became the living Horus, the falcon god whose eyes were the sun and moon. And in this identification, this fusion of human and divine, we see the establishment of a principle that would endure for 3,000 years. That rulership was not simply political power, but cosmic responsibility, that the king stood at the junction point between earth and heaven, between human community and divine order. At Abydos, in the desert behind the cultivation, the earliest royal tombs were cut into the ground, rooms and chambers lined with mud brick, roofed with timber brought from distant lands, and around these tombs were buried servants, retainers, people who would accompany the king into whatever realm awaited beyond death, a practice that speaks of both the value placed on continuity and the terrible weight of power in those formative years. Within these tombs, objects of staggering craftsmanship, vessels carved from stone so hard it would challenge modern tools, jewelry of gold and turquoise and carnelian, gaming boards for playing senet, that mysterious game whose rules have been lost, but whose boards appear again and again in burial contexts, suggesting it was more than mere entertainment, perhaps a symbolic journey, perhaps a way of negotiating fate. The sun, that most obvious and overwhelming presence in a land where clouds were rare and shade precious, began to accumulate layers of meaning. It was not merely light and heat, but a god, Ra, who traveled the sky in a boat, who each evening descended into the underworld and each morning emerged renewed, victorious over the forces of chaos and darkness. And this daily journey became a template, a cosmic pattern that human existence might echo and aspire to mirror. At Heliopolis, the city of the sun, now buried beneath modern Cairo's sprawl, priests developed cosmologies that would become foundational. They spoke of the primeval mound, the first land that rose from the waters of Nun, the infinite ocean of chaos that existed before creation. And on this mound stood Autumn, the complete one who brought forth from himself the first gods, Shu, the air, and Tefnut, moisture. And from their union came Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky, and thus the world took shape, structure emerging from formlessness, order from chaos. But this was only one telling. At Memphis, the ancient capital where the two lands joined, the god Ptah was understood as the creator, who brought the world into being not through biological generation, but through thought and speech, through divine word, conceiving creation in his heart and manifesting it through utterance. And this idea that consciousness and language could precede and shape material reality would resonate through Egyptian thought for millennia. The Pyramid Age had not yet begun. Those would come later. But already, stone was being worked in ways that suggest not just technical skill, but symbolic thinking. The step pyramid of Djoser, rising in stages like a stairway, like a crystallized form of the primeval mound, represented a leap in architectural ambition, in the ability to organize labor, to quarry and transport and precisely place massive blocks, and its architect, Imhotep, would himself eventually be deified, recognized as one who had achieved something beyond the ordinary human capacity. In these early dynasties, the third millennium before the Common Era, when Bronze Age civilizations were just beginning to coalesce around the Mediterranean and Near East, the people along the Nile were already developing a written language, hieroglyphs, sacred carvings, images that were simultaneously pictures and sounds, representations and abstractions. And this writing system, complex and beautiful and resistant to the kind of simplification that alphabets would later achieve, seemed perfectly suited to a worldview that saw meaning as layered, as requiring multiple levels of interpretation. The earliest religious texts, fragments and phrases found in tombs and on temple walls, speak in dense allusions, in formulas that clearly reference longer narratives now lost to us. They mention journeys through regions of the night, encounters with gatekeepers and judges, transformations into various forms, becoming a lotus flower, becoming a phoenix, becoming the morning sun. And these transformations suggest a fluidity of identity that stands in stark contrast to more fixed notions of selfhood. The idea that one might take different forms while remaining essentially oneself. Offerings were made daily, regularly, at tombs and shrines. Bread and beer, meat and fowl, incense and oil. And these offerings were not simply gifts in our modern sense. They were sustenance. They were the means by which the dead continued, by which the gods maintained their benevolent relationship with the human world. And the formulas that accompanied these offerings were carefully preserved, passed down, refined, becoming texts of power, utterances that could effect transformation, that could open doorways and establish connections between realms. The calendar itself became a sacred technology, the year divided into 3 seasons based on the river's cycle. Akhet, the inundation when the Nile rose and covered the fields. Peret, the emergence when the waters receded and crops could be planted. And Shemu, the harvest when grain was gathered before the next flood came. And this rhythm, so fundamental to survival, was understood as divine gift, as the result of cosmic order functioning as it should, as Ma'at, that essential principle of truth and balance and rightness, being maintained, and Ma'at herself, sometimes depicted as a goddess with an ostrich feather on her head, sometimes simply as the feather alone, came to represent the fundamental organizing principle of existence, the way things ought to be, the balance that must be maintained against the ever-present threat of chaos, of isfet, disorder and injustice, and the breakdown of proper relations. And the king's primary duty was understood as upholding Ma'at, ensuring that the cosmic and social order remained aligned, that rituals were performed, that truth was honored, that balance was preserved. In these formative centuries, these early dynasties, when Egypt was finding its form, consolidating its identity, developing the institutions and beliefs that would prove so remarkably enduring, we can see the seeds of everything that would follow. the gods taking shape, the afterlife acquiring geography and laws, the relationship between human and divine being articulated in stone and ritual and carefully preserved word, the past was already being venerated, already being looked to as a time of establishment, of foundation, when the gods walked the earth and the first kings received their authority directly from divine hands. And this orientation toward tradition, toward precedent, toward the tried and tested patterns, would become characteristic, would lead to a civilization that measured change in millennia rather than centuries, that found ways to absorb new ideas by claiming they were ancient, by discovering them in the old texts, in the time-honored forms. And so we arrive at the time of flowering, the Middle Kingdom, and the age that followed, when the beliefs that had been developing for centuries crystallized into forms that would define what we now recognize as the heart of this ancient vision. The pyramids already stood ancient by this time, weathered sentinels of an earlier age, and the great constructions of the Fourth Dynasty. Khufu's monument at Giza, Khafra's with its guardian sphinx, had become themselves objects of wonder even to those who lived 1,000 years after their building. Proof that the ancestors had achieved something of permanence, something that could outlast the individual life. The dynasty, the very language in which prayers were first uttered. But now, in this middle period, attention turned inward as much as upward. The elaborate royal burial complexes continued, yes, but alongside them emerged a democratization of access, a spreading of practices once reserved for kings alone. The coffin texts appeared, inscribed on the wooden boxes that held the dead, spells and maps and instructions for navigating the afterlife. And these texts reveal something profound, that the journey beyond death was now understood to be available not only to the god-king, but to anyone who could afford the proper preparations, the proper knowledge, the proper words of power. The journey itself, as described in these texts, was neither simple nor assured. The deceased would rise from the tomb, would need to know the names of the boat parts to secure passage, would encounter gates guarded by beings with unsettling names, blood drinker who comes from the slaughterhouse, bone breaker who comes from the house of torture. And these guardians would demand passwords, would test the deceased's knowledge, would determine worthiness not through moral judgment alone, but through precise recitation, through knowing the right formulas, the right responses. The heart, understood as the seat of thought and will and memory, would be weighed against the feather of Mayat in the Hall of Two Truths, and this moment, depicted again and again on papyrus and tomb wall, shows the deceased standing before a great balance, while Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian of the necropolis, adjusts the scales, and Thoth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods, records the result, and nearby waits Ammit, the devourer, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, ready to consume the hearts of those found wanting, those whose lives had been heavy with wrongdoing, with violation of Ma'at. But for those who passed this judgment, for those whose hearts balanced true against the feather, the afterlife opened into a realm called the Field of Reeds, Aru, a place imagined as an idealized version of Egypt itself, where crops grew abundantly, where the deceased would plow and sow and harvest in fields that never failed, where the Nile never flooded too high or too low, where existence continued in perfected form, eternal and secure. The gods by this time had developed complex relationships, family trees that twisted and merged in ways that defy simple genealogy. Osiris, once perhaps a local god of fertility and vegetation, had become the lord of the dead, the one who had himself died and been resurrected, whose story formed a central myth, murdered by his brother Set, the god of chaos and desert and foreign lands, dismembered and scattered, but gathered again by his wife Isis, whose magic was powerful enough to restore him to life, at least in the realm beyond death. And this myth, told and retold, elaborated and referenced, became a template for understanding death itself. Osiris had gone before, had made the journey, had shown that death need not be final, that proper ritual, proper devotion, proper knowledge could effect transformation, could turn the end into a beginning, the closing into an opening. Isis herself, the devoted wife, the powerful magician, the protective mother, accumulated epithets and powers. She became a goddess of 10,000 names, associated with the throne, with magic, with the star Sirius, whose heliacal rising coincided with the Nile's flood. She who could heal, who could protect, who knew the secret name of Ra himself, and thus held power even over the sun god. And her cult would eventually spread far beyond Egypt's borders, would be carried by merchants and soldiers and seekers to every corner of the Mediterranean world. Horus, the son of Isis and Osiris, born after his father's death, hidden in the marshes of the Delta, protected by his mother's magic from the murderous intentions of Set, grew to avenge his father, to battle Set for the throne of Egypt, and this conflict, cosmic and political simultaneously, was understood to replay itself in each succession, each new king becoming Horus, each dead king becoming Osiris, the pattern repeating, the roles passing from one generation to the next in eternal cycle. The temples grew larger, more elaborate. Karnak at Thebes expanded over centuries, each pharaoh adding halls and pylons and sanctuaries, creating a sacred complex of such vastness that one could walk for hours through columned forests, through courts where festivals were celebrated, through dark inner sanctums where only the highest priests could enter, where the god resided in statue form, tended daily like a living king, washed and dressed and offered food, awakened in the morning and put to rest at night. These rituals, performed daily behind closed doors, were essential to maintaining cosmic order. The god needed to be fed, needed to be honored, needed to receive the devotion that sustained the relationship between divine and human. And in return, the god provided protection, ensured the flood came, ensured the sun rose, ensured that Ma'at prevailed over chaos, that the world continued to function as it should. The priesthood became hereditary, specialized. There were priests who performed specific rituals, priests who maintained the temple complex, priests who interpreted dreams and omens, priests who could read the old texts, the archives that stretched back generations. And these priests held knowledge that was powerful, that was guarded, that was transmitted through apprenticeship and initiation, through years of learning the proper forms, the proper timing, the proper words that could not be altered without risking the efficacy of the ritual itself. Magic, Heka, was not separate from religion but intrinsic to it. The gods themselves used Heka. It was the force through which creation had been accomplished, through which the sunboat traveled each night through the underworld, through which transformations were effected, and humans could access this power through amulets inscribed with protective spells, through words spoken with proper intent, through knowing the true names of things. For to know the true name was to have power over the thing named. The Book of the Dead, that collection of spells that emerged in the New Kingdom, was never a single canonical text, but rather a library of options. A deceased person's family would select which spells to include, which transformations they wanted their loved one to be able to accomplish, and these papyri, sometimes stretching many feet in length, beautifully illustrated with vignettes showing the deceased adoring gods, sailing in boats, transforming into various forms, accompanied the body into the tomb, placed near the mummy where it could be accessed, where its power could be activated through the ritual of the opening of the mouth. This ceremony, performed on the mummy and on statues, meant to serve as eternal homes for the life force, involved touching the mouth and eyes with sacred implements, with the pesesh kef blade, with the adze used in carpentry, and through these ritual touches, through the accompanying spells, the senses were restored. The deceased could again see and hear and speak and eat, could again participate in existence even while existing in a different realm. The ka, the ba, the ak, these elements of selfhood were distinguished in ways that our single word soul cannot capture. The ka was the life force, the vital energy that animated the body, symbolized by upraised arms, sustained through offerings. The ba was closer to what we might call personality, depicted as a human-headed bird that could move between the tomb and the world of the living, that could enjoy the shade of trees, that could return to the body, and the ak was the transformed state, the blessed dead who had successfully navigated the afterlife's trials, who shone like stars, who had become effective spirits capable of interceding in the world of the living. At certain times of year, festivals brought the gods out from their dark sanctuaries, their statues placed in portable shrines carried on the shoulders of priests, processioning through the streets, and the people could approach, could ask questions that would be answered through the movements of the carriers, yes or no. The god's shrine tilting forward or drawing back, divine judgment made manifest, accessible to ordinary people, to those seeking justice, seeking confirmation, seeking connection with powers beyond themselves. The Opet festival at Thebes, one of the grandest, saw the statue of Amun journey from Karnak to Luxor Temple, a distance of several miles, accompanied by musicians and dancers, by offerings of flowers and incense, by the pharaoh himself, and this journey, repeated annually, renewed the king's divine mandate, recharged his royal ka, ensured that the relationship between God and king remained strong, that the cosmic order remained intact. Animals sacred to particular gods were kept at temples, fed and tended with reverence. The Apis bull at Memphis, recognized by specific markings, was understood as a manifestation of Ta, and when the bull died, it was mummified and buried with full ceremony in the Serapeum, in catacombs lined with massive granite sarcophagi, and a new Apis would be sought, would be found, would take up the divine role, the God made flesh in a form that could be seen and approached and honored, cats in Bubastis, ibises at Hermopolis, crocodiles at Kom Ombo. Each temple complex had its sacred animals, and pilgrims would come bearing mummified animals as offerings, cats and ibises and dogs and hawks, bred specifically for this purpose, mummified by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands, offered to the gods, in a practice that speaks to the accessibility of devotion, that anyone could participate, could make an offering, could seek favor, or give thanks, or simply express reverence. The desert, always present, always pressing against the narrow, fertile strip of the river valley, was the domain of Set, the red land, as opposed to the black land of cultivation, and yet the desert also held sacred sites. Osiris was said to be buried at Abydos, and pilgrims journeyed there, left stelae inscribed with prayers, with requests that they might share in Osiris's resurrection, that their names might be remembered, that offerings might be made for them in perpetuity. Memory, remembrance, the speaking of the name, these were forms of continued existence. To be forgotten was to die a second death. To have one's name erased from monuments was to be unmade, and so the wealthy commissioned tombs decorated with scenes of daily life, of feasting and farming and fishing, not just to provide magically for the afterlife, but to preserve their identity, to ensure that their names would be spoken, that they would be remembered, that they would continue. The centuries turned. Dynasties rose and fell. Foreign rulers came. The Hyksos from the east with their chariots and composite bows. The Cushites from the south who claimed the ancient traditions as their own, and through these changes, through periods of fragmentation and reunion, through conquest and resistance, the religious framework endured, adapted, absorbed new elements while maintaining its essential structures. The new kingdom brought empire, wealth flowing into Egypt from Nubia and the Levant, gold and tribute and captives, and this wealth was poured into the temples. Karnak expanded to unprecedented scale, its hypostyle hall with 134 columns arranged in rows like a petrified forest, each column thick enough that it would take 6 people linking hands to encircle it, and the capitals, carved as papyrus bundles, as lotus blossoms, transformed stone into vegetation, the temple itself becoming a symbolic representation of the primeval marsh from which creation emerged. Akhenaten, the heretic king, attempted something unprecedented, a revolution in religion itself. He closed the temples of the traditional gods, declared that only the Aten, the sun disk, was to be worshipped, moved the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, and for a brief period, perhaps 17 years, the old practices were suppressed, the many gods rejected in favor of one, and the art of the period shows this shift. The king and his family depicted in intimate moments, raising their hands to the sun, whose rays end in tiny hands offering ankhs, offering life. But this transformation, so radical, so contrary to the accumulated weight of tradition, could not survive its instigator. When Akhenaten died, when his young son-in-law Tutankhamun took the throne, the old gods returned, the temples reopened, the priests regained their authority, and Akhenaten's name was erased from king lists, his monuments dismantled, his city abandoned to the desert sand, as if the entire episode could be undone, could be excised from the continuous thread of tradition. Yet something had been revealed, the possibility of change, the recognition that what had seemed eternal was, in fact, contingent, was maintained through choice and power, and the consent of those who upheld it. And though the restoration was complete on the surface, though the old forms returned in force, perhaps something subtle had shifted, some recognition of the constructed nature of the divine order. The Ramesside period that followed saw a reassertion of tradition. Ramesses II, who would reign for 67 years, covered the land with monuments proclaiming his piety, his victories, his role as intermediary between gods and humanity. The great temple at Abu Simbel, cut into the living rock, its facade dominated by 4 colossal seated figures of the king, and twice a year the sun would penetrate deep into the interior, would illuminate the sanctuary where statues of the gods sat alongside the deified king. Cosmic alignment made architectural, time and space and stone coordinated in demonstration of order, of control, of the proper functioning of Ma'at. But time was already beginning its slow work of transformation. The great age of pyramid building lay a millennium in the past. The Old Kingdom was as distant to Ramesses as Ramesses is now to us, and there was already a sense of looking backward, of trying to maintain connection with an ever-receding origin. Copies were made of older texts. Archives were consulted. Precedents were sought in the records of ancestors who themselves had been consulting the records of their ancestors. The Third Intermediate Period brought fragmentation. The kingdom split between competing powers, Libyan dynasties in the north, Nubian dynasties in the south, and through this political chaos the temples became centers of continuity, repositories of tradition and learning, the priests maintaining the daily rituals even as the identity of the nominal ruler shifted. Even as Egypt's power in the wider world waned, foreign gods began to appear. Astarte from the Levant, Baal and Anat, absorbed into the Egyptian pantheon, identified with local deities, Astarte with Sekhmet perhaps, or existing alongside, the theological flexibility that had always characterized Egyptian religion allowing for these additions, these expansions of the divine assembly. And Egyptian gods traveled outward too. Isis and Serapis, a Hellenized form of Osiris, would eventually have temples in Rome, in Athens, in cities throughout the Mediterranean world. The late periods saw Persian conquest, then liberation, then conquest again. The Persians took the titles of pharaoh. Some made offerings to Egyptian gods, participated in the forms of legitimate rule, while others were remembered as oppressors, as violators of sacred sites, the distinction perhaps depending less on actual policy than on the success or failure of their reign, on whether they were seen as upholding or disrupting Ma'at. Alexander came, conquered, died young, and his general Ptolemy took Egypt, founded a dynasty that would last 3 centuries. And the Ptolemies, Greek-speaking, Macedonian in origin, nevertheless presented themselves as pharaohs, built temples in the traditional style, had themselves depicted on walls wearing the double crown, performing the ancient rituals, making offerings to gods whose myths they may or may not have believed, but whose symbolic power they certainly recognized. The temple at Edfu, built during the Ptolemaic period, preserves on its walls something precious. The myth of the conflict between Horus and Set, recorded in detail, a narrative that had surely been told for millennia, but here finds literary form, and the temple itself, remarkably preserved, its pylon and courtyard and hypostyle hall still standing, gives us perhaps the clearest picture of what these sacred spaces looked like, how they functioned, how the architecture guided movement from the public outer courts through progressively more restricted spaces toward the sanctuary where the god resided in darkness. The walls were covered with texts, offering scenes, king lists, astronomical ceilings showing the night sky, the deacons, the constellations through which the sun passed, and these inscriptions served multiple purposes. They were decoration, they were instruction, they were magical protection, they were permanent prayer. They ensured that the rituals would continue even if every priest forgot them. Because the walls themselves remembered, the stone preserved the knowledge against time's erosion. Cleopatra, the seventh of that name, the last Ptolemaic ruler, spoke Egyptian, participated in the religious festivals, had herself depicted in traditional royal regalia on temple walls, and when she died, when Egypt became a Roman province, when Augustus took control, the temples continued to function. Tourists from Rome came to marvel at the pyramids, at the colossi, at monuments already ancient beyond their comprehension. New temples were built, even under Roman rule, at Dendera, at Philae, in traditional forms, with traditional iconography, the gods still receiving their offerings, still being awakened and fed and honored. But increasingly, these practices existed in a world that had moved on, that had other gods, other philosophies, other ways of understanding the relationship between human and divine. Christianity spread, first as a persecuted minority, then as official religion, and the temples were closed by imperial edict. The statues were sometimes destroyed, sometimes defaced, sometimes simply abandoned, and the knowledge of how to read hieroglyphs, maintained for 3,000 years through unbroken chains of priestly instruction, finally broke. The last person who could read the sacred writing died, and the texts became mere decoration, beautiful but mute, their voices silenced. Yet the monuments remained, the pyramid, the temples, the tombs, enduring through centuries of sand and sun and occasional flood, occasionally quarried for building stone, occasionally occupied by hermits and monks, occasionally wondered at by travelers who could not read the inscriptions but could sense the weight of time, the accumulated devotion, the civilizational confidence that had believed building in stone for eternity was not hubris but appropriate, was simply what one did when one understood the cosmic order and one's place within it. The knowledge was not entirely lost. Traditions persisted in fragmented form, in folk practices, in the Coptic language that descended from ancient Egyptian, in stories and local customs that carried echoes of older beliefs. The memory blurred, transformed, but not entirely erased, waiting in a sense for the day when the code would be broken, when Champollion would decipher the Rosetta Stone, when the voices preserved in stone would speak again, and in speaking they would reveal not a primitive superstition, not a simple fear-driven propitiation of natural forces, but a sophisticated theological system, a comprehensive worldview that had grappled with the fundamental questions of existence, that had developed multiple complementary answers, that had created space for both grand cosmic mythology and intimate personal devotion, that had built institutions capable of lasting longer than any empire before or since. The gods did not demand belief in the way later monotheisms would. They did not require faith as internal conviction. What they required was proper action, correct ritual, the maintenance of ma'at through behavior, through offerings, through the speaking of the right words at the right time. And this emphasis on orthopraxy rather than orthodoxy allowed for a remarkable flexibility, a tolerance for contradiction, a comfort with mystery that never insisted on reducing the divine to a single coherent system. Multiple truths could coexist. The sun could be Ra in the morning, Atum in the evening, could be identified with Horus, could be the eye of the sky goddess, could be all of these simultaneously without any sense that these different formulations canceled each other out. And this multiplicity, this layering of meaning, reflected perhaps a deep understanding that the divine, whatever its ultimate nature, could not be captured in any single image, any single story, any single name. The civilization that created this religious vision is gone, its language a subject of academic study, its monuments preserved in museums and carefully maintained archaeological sites. But something of its achievement endures in the questions it asked, in the answers it proposed to, in the sheer audacity of believing that humans could build for eternity, could maintain order, could transform death into doorway, could know the names of gods, and perhaps what calls to us across these thousands of years, what still resonates in the quiet hours when we contemplate our own mortality, our own place in the vast sweep of time, is not so much the specific beliefs, the particular gods with their animal heads and their mythic genealogies, but rather the underlying impulse, the refusal to accept death as absolute ending, the insistence that meaning could be made, could be preserved, could outlast the fragile vessel of flesh and bone. They looked at the stars, those points of light that wheeled overhead with perfect regularity, and saw in that celestial order a template, a pattern that earthly life should mirror. The king was not just a political leader, but a cosmic functionary, responsible for maintaining alignment between above and below, between the divine realm and the human, and when he failed, when Ma'at was violated, when injustice prevailed or ritual was neglected, the consequences were understood to be not merely social but cosmological. The very fabric of reality threatened with unraveling. This is a vision of enormous coherence, of existence understood as fundamentally interconnected, where nothing stood alone, where every action rippled outward, where the proper preparation of a body for burial, the correct pronunciation of a spell, the faithful performance of a daily temple ritual by a priest the king would never meet, all these things mattered. All contributed to the maintenance of order. All played their part in holding chaos at bay. The tombs themselves, those houses of eternity, speak to this understanding of interconnection. They were not meant to be sealed and forgotten, but to be visited, to receive offerings, to remain part of the community of the living, even as their occupants had crossed into the community of the justified dead, and the scenes painted on their walls, the biographical inscriptions, the prayers for bread and beer and all good things, these were not mere decoration but active magical technology, ensuring through representation that what was depicted would continue, would be available, would sustain the deceased through eternity. There is something moving in this, in the caretaken, in the conviction that carved stone and preserved body and properly spoken word could achieve what seems impossible, could defeat time, could maintain identity across the boundary of death. The mother who placed amulets between the wrappings of her child's mummy, the son who commissioned a stela for his father's tomb, the priest who performed the offering ritual for ancestors he had never known, all participating in a vast intergenerational project, a collective effort to ensure that death would not have final victory, and the gods themselves, in their multiplicity, in their complexity, in their refusal to be simple, seem almost to acknowledge the inadequacy of any single story, any single image, to capture the fullness of divine reality. Ra can be depicted as a man with a falcon head crowned with the sun disk, or as a scarab beetle pushing the solar disk across the sky, or as an old man leaning on a staff in the evening, or as a cat killing the serpent of chaos. And each image reveals something true, something partial, something that needs the other images to complete it. This comfort with paradox, with multiple simultaneous truths, with both and rather than either or, allowed Egyptian religion to absorb foreign influences without losing its identity, to evolve without breaking continuity, to maintain traditions across spans of time that saw empires rise and fall, languages evolve beyond recognition, technologies transform, and through all this change, the essential patterns persisted: the daily ritual, the care for the dead, the maintenance of Ma'at, the relationship between human and divine mediated through image and offering and carefully preserved word. We might ask what was lost when the temples closed, when the last hieroglyphs were carved, when the knowledge of how to read them died with its keepers. And the answer is not just information, not just historical data, but an entire way of being in the world, a framework for understanding existence that had proven remarkably durable, remarkably sustaining, for longer than our current civilization has yet endured. The silence that fell was profound. The monuments remained, but their voices were stilled. The gods no longer received their daily bread, no longer were awakened at dawn and put to rest at evening, no longer traveled in festival procession through streets lined with celebrants. The complex theological debates, the priestly scholarship, the lived experience of a religion that had shaped every aspect of existence, from the grandest state ceremony to the smallest household shrine. All this contracted, fragmented, survived only in traces, in half-remembered customs, in stories whose meanings had been forgotten. And yet, the monuments endured, waiting perhaps for a time when they could speak again, when the code could be broken, when modern minds could begin, however imperfectly, to reconstruct something of what had been lost. The desert wind moves across the sand as it has always moved, erasing footprints, revealing what was buried, burying what was revealed, and the temples stand patient in the sun, their shadows shortening and lengthening with the day's passage, their stones holding memories of hands long turned to dust, of voices that spoke in a language no living person learned at their mother's knee. I walk again through those columned halls, feeling the coolness of stone that has known both the heat of noon and the chill of desert night for thousands of years. And the silence here is not empty but full, dense with accumulated time, with the weight of all those prayers and offerings and carefully performed rituals, with the hopes of those who believed they were building something eternal and who were not entirely wrong. Because something does endure, not the specific beliefs perhaps, not the daily practices, not the living relationship between devotee and deity that characterized the religion in its flowering, but the achievement itself, the creation of a symbolic universe so rich, so layered, so carefully constructed that we are still unpacking its meanings, still discovering its depths, still finding in its art and architecture and texts new ways of thinking about the perennial human questions. The sun sets as it set for those ancient priests, as it set for the workers who carved the tombs, as it set for the pharaohs who built the temples, and in its setting we might see what they saw, not merely a physical phenomenon, but a cosmic drama. Ra, beginning his nightly journey through the underworld, facing the serpent of chaos, navigating dangers, and emerging triumphant at dawn, renewed, victorious, the pattern repeating, the cycle continuing, death followed always by rebirth. The stars emerge one by one, and they are the same stars those ancient astronomers studied, mapped, incorporated into their cosmology, the same patterns, the same slow wheeling across the seasons. And for a moment the distance collapses. The separation between then and now feels less absolute. We are all looking at the same sky, all trying to make meaning from the mystery of existence, all facing the same fundamental questions about life and death and what, if anything, lies beyond. The night deepens, the darkness becomes complete, and in this darkness, this absence of light that the ancient Egyptians knew so well, there is also a kind of peace, a letting go of the need to understand everything, to have all answers, to resolve all paradoxes. Perhaps what they knew, what they built their entire civilization around, was the possibility of living gracefully with mystery, of creating beauty and meaning in the face of uncertainty, of building something lasting while acknowledging the reality of impermanence. The monuments will outlast us as they outlasted their builders. The stone will endure longer than memory, longer than language, longer than the specific meanings encoded in carved relief and painted plaster, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the achievement lies not in the permanence of belief, but in the act of building, of creating, of attempting to touch something eternal, even knowing that we ourselves are bound by time. The wind has stopped, the air perfectly still, and in this stillness, this suspension between day and night, between past and present, between what was known and what remains mysterious, there is a quality of attention, of waiting, as if the stones themselves are listening, as if the accumulated devotion of millennia has left something in the air, some residue of reverence, of care, of the human capacity to reach beyond ourselves towards something greater, and slowly, so slowly that the transition is barely perceptible, the darkness begins to thin, the first intimation of dawn touching the eastern horizon, and another day begins, another cycle, another turning of the wheel that has turned since before pyramids rose from the desert floor, since before the first hieroglyph was carved, since before humans looked at the stars and wondered and found in their wondering the seeds of all the stories, all the gods, all the elaborate cosmologies that would grow and flower and eventually fade, leaving only stones and silence and the endless patient turning of the earth beneath an unchanging sky.